Oh yeah, you're right. There we are. Now it should be working.
All right, let me check. Yeah, it's working now.
So yeah, we're gonna be you're a Kantian ethics kind of guy, right?
I described my ethics as role-based and content-inspired, not necessarily completely content, though.
All right. But you're like a raw deontologist. You're not like a threshold deontologist or anything like that, right?
I am not.
All right. Do you have like what are the like main axioms you kind of work under?
The most basic idea, I think, to describe what I believe is that morality is typically covering what's called rationality by Kant, and this describes a respect and the ability to exercise autonomy. And that's basically it.
Respect and the ability to exercise autonomy.
Hmm. And so anyone who's irrational as an actor um, must be sufficiently taken care of so as to not um, disadvantage or potentially endanger anyone who is a rational actor.
So they're are they worthy of less moral consideration or no moral consideration?
No moral consideration would be extended to someone like, well, not even a someone, like a rock, for example. Someone who'd be considered of lesser moral consideration would be kind of dependent on the context, but like if it were the case that you were like stealing from me, you'd have lesser moral consideration in that case. I'd have to take the sufficient means in order to take care of what you're doing, or to be a little more specific, to protect my property.
All right, and do you hold the idea that like defending your property is like of paramount importance? Like if somebody steals your wallet, it's okay for you to kill them?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that. I think that goes beyond the uh, sufficient means to take care of that particular situation. Unless like someone's robbing you at like gunpoint or something, then maybe it's different. But
So it'd be like a minimum reasonable force applied, correct?
yeah, because I don't know if you can necessarily say that we have access to an objective morality, but I think we can come pretty close in universalizing it. So what I would try and do is meet the requisites of most people's standards, because there's a level of social consideration when you're being autonomous, and then there's also just a general level of reason to be taken into account when you're making a decision like that. Like someone stealing your property isn't them necessarily trying to give away their life, right?
No.
So yeah, I don't think that would be a sufficient reason to kill them. If someone like stole $5 from me because I left it on the lunch table, I would then like shoot them in the head.
So you were talking about how you give ethical consideration based on rationality, correct?
Hmm.
Rationality and what was the other thing? Ability to respect someone's autonomy.
Well, the way yeah, I'm using it in like a Kantian sense. So whenever I'm gonna say rationality, unless said otherwise, I just mean the ability to exercise autonomy, and then the having of respect for it. And then I can explain autonomy if you.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead and explain what you mean by autonomy.
Well, there are three levels of autonomy. So the first level is just if you want to do something and you do it, that's an act of autonomy. So if you want to drink a glass of water and then you pick up the glass of water and drink it, that's autonomy. That's the lowest level, and that's like what we'd consider the most basal form of autonomy, which is pretty much extended to really any sentient creature. and probably some form of AI. Um, as for having a greater level of autonomy, you would go so far as to say, if you understand the repercussions of this and you understand the general consequences attached and you do it, then you've enacted autonomy. So if I want to, I don't know, buy a gun, knowing that buying a gun might, for example, allow me to kill someone at a later date, but also allow me to protect myself, and I weigh out these consequences and I'm aware of them. And these are just very general consequences attached. Then I've autonomously made that decision. The final one is the one we hold governing bodies to, only because they would really be capable of this level of autonomy. But it would be when you are aware of like more specific consequences. So if, say, the government were to enact an immigration policy, the government would have to be aware of how this would affect things like the GDP, how this would affect spending power, or excuse me, purchasing power, how this might affect unemployment of particular categories, that sort of thing, before they implement it, for it to really be called autonomy.
So it sounds like if you have an incompetent government, they have a hell of a lot less value to you.
Say that one more time.
So it sounds like if you have an incompetent government that makes decisions irrationally, the government itself would be viewed as less, having less authority, I guess.
Yeah, what they're doing is immoral, and they shouldn't be allowed to do it.
All right, that makes sense. Do you like hold to the idea that lying is universally wrong in every circumstance? I know that's a Kantian idea.
I'm in a bit of a gray area here, and I think there are going to be a lot of gray areas for most ethical systems, and I don't think mine is too unique in that. But I'd say that lying is bad pretty much never in. That's really practical. But I guess if you were to take it to its most absurd, it could be a problem.
So, lying to a killer about the location of his target, that'd be something you might be alright with?
Yeah, because I think that killer is going to jeopardize the lives of some people. So I think lying in that case is a way to sufficiently stop them from killing.
Alright, when you say, you are, if you have somebody who's like, disabled, like they can't move their arms or legs or anything, that person has less autonomy, correct?
Correct.
So is that person of less value?
Not necessarily, because it's like set up as more of a binary, much in the same way we wouldn't consider a newborn less valuable than an adult. But if you're asking like what we would do with a person in that situation, it would depend on whether people are willing to take care of that person.
So if nobody was willing to take care of that person, you wouldn't be fine with the society saying somebody that has to take care of that person?
Wait, could you rephrase the question?
Alright, well, let's say, hold on a second. Let's say hypothetically, you had a person who, they were completely paralyzed. And
Okay.
in your society, it is required that somebody has to take care of that person. They can't just like be left to die. Is that something that you would consider to be immoral?
No, I think if people agree to taking care of that person, that's fine. I think it's a case though, and I think this might be more to your point. If no one is willing to take care of that person, I don't think anyone in particular has an obligation. But personally, if that person were existent, I would try and take care of.
But if you didn't exist, you wouldn't have a problem with everybody just saying, okay, this is somebody else's problem.
Yeah, because I don't think that violates autonomy in any way.
Well, you could have. Oh man, that I think I can get you to say some really fucked up crap now. Um, Trying to think. Like, I want to steel man you before I kind of attack your position. So, if there were like some sort of huge disaster that any individual person in society could stop, but nobody stops, you would say that there's no evil value in their inaction?
Um, no, I think that if you could stop it, you probably should.
Seems kind of weird that if we're talking about like a large scale thing, you're saying that we should stop it, but when we're talking about taking care of a disabled person, you don't seem to think that there should be an obligation to take care of them.
Well, I think there's a difference, right? So if I could press a button to end all of the world's problems, somehow in some way, right? I would press it. Um, and the reason I would be morally obligated to press it is because I have to respect the autonomy of others, right? Specifically, their autonomy in wishing not to be fucking killed or to have problems riddling their lives.
So within your system, seems like there's another axiom at play that requires you to respect the what's it called positive liberty of other people.
I yeah, you could say that. You mean positive rights, correct?
Yeah, all right. That makes your position a lot more defensible than the people who I was debating with beforehand.
Yeah, I'm not a libertarian. Well, I technically am, just not like a weird, like right leaning libertarian. I'm willing to make like social and economic policies if it's helpful.
Hmm. So, all right. If somebody else were in that position, you're not the one who can press the button. If that person does not press the button, would you call that person evil?
Yeah.
All right. Well, that gets you out of the whole genocide by inaction. Yeah, I can't believe that they couldn't figure out a way to deal with that. That was kind of
Yeah,
crazy.
I'd say theoretically though, and I do admit this is something you could reduce to absurdity on my part. If no one had the means, or if no one really like cared enough, and there wasn't like any realistic means by which you could succeed in taking care of like a bunch of like people fucked over by a natural disaster, um, you could say that my system supports the abandonment of these people, which it technically would,
Well,
and that's fucked up. But
let's say like let's talk about refugees. Like, what if since we're on the topic of like natural disasters and stuff, so if there's a huge earthquake that destroys most of Mexico, do you think that the United States is morally obligated to take care of Mexican refugees?
um, it would depend on the means by which we accomplish this. But I would probably say yes. It would just depend on the means.
Hmm, that's interesting. I just don't see why I can't. You're able to make that decision for large scale events, but when I talk about an individual person who needs help, like you would argue that it has to be the government that steps in. It sounds like.
Yeah, because well, this is like the market difference, or the mark difference. In the large scale events, we're assuming that people can and are willing to help. Specifically me, because you're asking like whether I would be willing to. What I would say, but in the individual case, you're basically removing all people who could like ever care. So like we're comparing the most nihilistic society potentially to basically like what we have now, which I think isn't too bad.
I think it's pretty fair to say, like, okay, well, what if you have a bunch of people who don't feel the moral obligations to your ethical system? like, what would it be wrong to call them evil in this sense or something like that? It seems kind of valid to me. Like, because when you're arguing from a utilitarian point of view, you have to do it from what's the term? It's like the unbiased observer. Like, you remove yourself from the situation because you'd say, okay, well, if I'm going to injure myself by carrying this person to a safe area, I don't want to do it. But I would argue from an unbiased standpoint, I should take one from the team and help carry this person to safety. Like, I think it's fair to say, okay, well, if you have a bunch of nihilists who are like, absolutely none of them want to help this one person who's hurt, then how would your moral system, or would it be evil for them to do so or not, basically?
Yeah, the only reason I'm willing to bite the bullet on saying, yeah, I don't think they should is because I think that the moment you force people to, for example, take care of someone they would otherwise not take care of, you could have a very strong reduction to absurdity and basically condoning slavery. Specifically, if we take if this person benefits from it more than these other people not benefiting from it or being detrimented by it, then the person benefiting should be tended to. And you could make the case that slave owners were tended to and were the beneficiaries of slavery, and they benefited a lot more than slaves were detrimented. So it's just I have to choose what bullets I'm willing to bite, because I think you have to deal with every moral system. Like, if you want to talk about the problems of consequentialism, you could theoretically examine it through the lens of like something Nozick brings up, specifically with utility monsters, or the fact that consequentialism isn't too rigorous an ethical theory. So you could potentially use it to demonstrate really anything, or at least any like level of absurdity.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the utility monster thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
so obviously it comes down to what bullets you're willing to bite.
Yeah, but I would argue that for most of the time, biting the bullet on a utility monster thing doesn't really, when you scale it down, it stops seeming absurd. For example, would I save a ant or a human being? Well, or something like would I let 100 ants die if it meant saving a human being? Well, it sounds kind of messed up that I'm going to let 100 ants die, but a human being is definitely, I'm going to enjoy life more than those 100 ants. So you could say, okay, well, what if we scale this up? There is this hypothetical monster that required the death of our universe to exist. You could say, okay, well, to that monster, that thing, we are basically ants. It seems like it follows the same principle. Like, if I were that monster, I'd be making the same argument.
Correct.
The issue I have with any sort of deontological framework that would excuse inaction is you could have a situation where it makes the net benefit. Basically, society as a whole doesn't really seem to benefit if nobody wants to take responsibility. Like, you kind of need everybody to play ball.
Yeah, and I think to a certain extent that people, I mean, like, unless everyone's like fucking suicidal, then in that case, like, it doesn't matter, right? But in the case that we're going to talk about with everyday people, I think deontology tends to work a little more effectively. The specific problem I have regarding the utility monsters is you could, depending on your envisioning of what consequentialism describes, so it might be utilitarianism, and then whether it's negative or positive, then what you might, or rather rule or act based, then you might end up describing to me how we can defend rape, or how we can end up defending the genocide of the entire human race. And I think these are a lot less fucking defensible than, say, would you let a random comatose patient die, and I'd be like, yeah, probably, but I wouldn't like defend a rape or the genocide of humanity.
Well, in terms of rape, you're causing harm.
Okay, if you're going with the harm principle, then the way to reduce the amount of harm we have on the world is just to kill all people. So you'd have to defend the genocide of people because
Well, that
there's less long term harm.
well, no, because then I'd argue that you're nullifying all the well-being. People cannot experience well-being if they're dead. Their sensations are gone.
So either you have to treat it as a matter of it being a minimalization of harm or a maximization of well-being. So you have to pick here because if you just choose one over the other, you're choosing one and then the other arbitrarily when we're asking the same questions. Then you run into the same problem of having an incoherent system.
Now, I can argue that my goal isn't necessarily to have it even out. It's to create a very positive ratio. So I would argue that the only reason why I would defend the genocide of all humans is because they're all in a state where their suffering is greatly exceeding their well-being. That's the only time I defend it.
Okay, so do you think all of humanity should be genocided? Because that is the case. Like every day is suffering for people.
Yeah, but we also experience positive emotions every day.
Sure, but you know that in the long term we're going to have more suffering.
Um, I don't know about that. I think people downplay the positive experiences they have. Like, I personally would
Well,
rather keep existing. I think that I've overall been feeling more positive emotions than negative ones.
yeah, you probably would rather keep existing. And so it's then a matter of, well, does it come out to maximizing well being or does it come out to minimizing well being?
Or you mean minimizing suffering?
Or minimizing suffering, my bad. So I
Well,
don't know, is it a matter of maximizing well being or minimizing suffering?
well, it's a ratio. I want to have the ratio be positive. Like, ideally, it should be as positive as possible. So we should be maximizing suffering, or maximizing well-being and minimizing suffering as much as possible. But like, you're going to have actions that are going to cause that are going to increase your well-being while causing suffering. So you have to kind of figure out what the ratio is going to be for each action.
Okay, so then how would you decide this ratio for something like a war-torn country?
Uh, for doing what with a war-torn country?
Like, how would you decide the solution to a war-torn country under your consequentialist framework?
I'm not sure. I understand the question. I think like this would be like one of those situations where you'd have to like carefully evaluate everything. Like if you're asking like should we
Just your general solution. Like, it's like a very general thing. Like, you just know it has a problem of war.
so like if the country is war torn, I'd advocate for trying to fix it. But I feel like there's something not being said in this example.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to get at is just like when you say there's a positive ratio, right? Like you're setting up a calculus of. My problem with doing this is it's not very clear on how you even make this calculus, and so I'm trying to figure out by what methods do you decide this calculus.
Well, I have to work on incomplete information because I can't understand how people think, solipsism and all that. But like I guess the best way to do it is to try to put myself in the position of the other person and say, okay, how much would I feel like I'm suffering in this situation, and how happy would I be in this situation?
Okay. And then I don't know, like I think there's a general epistemological problem here that's not like really being settled. Like even if you're willing to, and I don't know, I feel like even this hasn't been properly answered, but I feel like even if we were to just like leave the utility monsters alone for a second, I just don't see how you would make any real calculus. Like, firstly, you'd have to decide a set of values, and the way you would settle on those values has to be independently decided of the consequentialism, because consequentialism itself doesn't really decide values.
Sure. Well,
Um,
I have to make decisions within a consequentialist framework.
mhm.
So
And
like,
so, continue.
I wouldn't say like, okay, my utilitarianism requires me to act in this way. I would have to go through a bunch of different decisions and try to make an educated guess. I think one of the advantages of deontology is it's everything's kind of like simplified. So like, just don't fuck with this person, don't rock the boat, stuff like that. But like, I don't think simplifying it in that way necessarily produces positive results.
Well, positive results is almost like begging the question, because I think positive results would be, in your case, a reflection of a consequentialist framework.
Well, like, to a degree, when we're dealing with ethics, we're kind of going with a presupposition as to what is good and what is bad.
Yeah, I mean, we can get into meta ethics if that's a little bit easier. I just don't know about your background with meta ethics.
I have no background in meta ethics. I think I would be described as an anti-realist.
You don't think there are objective moral facts?
How would you prove an objective moral fact?
I mean, there are a variety of ways which you can do it. I mean, one you could do is the origination of where exactly morality comes from. And the way we could do that is to look either through a naturalist or non-naturalist or supernaturalist lens.
What's the lens that led you to moral realism?
Specifically, I don't know. It's weird to say. I don't want to say necessarily a non-naturalist lens, but probably a non-naturalist. I think morality is more of an abstraction than anything.
So you think it occurs in nature?
No, I think it occurs in the non-natural world. I don't think it's natural. I think it's an abstraction, kind of like math.
All right. Well, like, I would say that like it's something that's entirely based on human observation. Like, I don't think that I think if you remove all humans from the situation and just let animals kind of just do whatever they please, there is no morality in that situation anymore. It's just animals doing whatever.
Oh, I'm not a robust moral realist. I'm undecided on that much. I don't know if I'd say necessarily there are objective moral duties, but I'd be willing to say there are facts of the matter regarding what morality is. Like, for example, if you tell me that morality is subjective, that's a fact about morality, or at least that's what you're proposing as a fact about morality. So I'm like a moral realist in that sense, and I think that's the sense most people would mean it in. A robust moral realist is the person who describes it as there being objective moral duties.
So what would you say is an example of a moral fact?
Whether it's subjective or objective.
Well, no, I mean, like, would you say killing is wrong is an objective moral fact?
You can this is like, I don't know, it's like a weird like semantics thing. It might come off a little weird. So like, think of it more like regarding rather than saying what specifically it's condoning. So for example, if you're an atheist, you have a religious stance, but you are not religious, right? Like, your stance on religion is that either you don't find reason to be compelled, or you are not someone who is convinced at all and think there is no God, depending on like what you'd consider your level of atheism to be. Or you might have a stance on, I don't know, a science, right? But this doesn't necessarily mean that in you saying that there are facts about science, science says X. you can still say there are facts about science without necessarily saying science says X. So all I'm saying is like you can talk about morality like as a concept itself and state facts about it without necessarily saying that they're objective things that we have to do morally speaking. So I can say, and I'll give you an example. I could say potentially something Sam Harris says. Morality is a matter of well-being. That would be like more a consideration of like a moral duty, right? But a moral fact in the broader sense would be like morality is subjective. That itself is a moral fact because it's a fact about morality as a concept. Does that make sense at all?
I think I followed like half of that.
Yeah, all I'm saying is you can state facts about morality. Saying morality is subjective is potentially a fact itself about morality, but it's not saying that like because morality is subjective, we should do X.
All right, but like saying morality is subjective doesn't change. Doesn't like that saying that's a moral fact doesn't like nullify moral anti-realism.
It does, because robust moral realism is the one that concerns like moral objectivism.
So wait, this seems like you're trying to argue through semantics though, because you're basically saying, okay, if we take this one step back and argue meta ethics, we can say, okay, there is an objective fact about meta ethics, and then we can say, okay, since we have one objective fact about it, even though nothing within the ethical system itself has been proven objective, we can then argue that moral objectivity is a thing. But that doesn't if
no, I'm not. I'm saying that there are objective facts about morality. I don't think there's really an objective moral system, at least one that we have access to, and that's like the next part I was going to get into. I don't think that just because we don't have access to an objective moral system, we necessarily have to concede the grounds to being entirely subjective with it. And I wouldn't really go the route of cultural relativism either, because I think there are a lot of errors in that. I think the best thing we can do, if not objective moral duties, is trying to universalize moral duties. Would you agree with that or no?
I mean, I agree with it in the sense that I would want to universalize my own ethical system, but I don't necessarily think that I would require all the same responsibilities of every single person.
No, I mean more so like if we had to choose between just letting everyone do whatever they want, and there being no real bounds. And so the serial rapist is equivalent to you, who's just like a random like YouTuber, right? That would be less ideal, I think, intersubjectively here than a system by which all people would abide and adhere to, because they are characteristics of the moral duties that are applicable to all people.
I mean, this seems like a subjective judgment in itself, though.
It is, of course, but you can go with intersubjectivity to the highest degree, which would be universalism.
So basically, a lot of people agree with it. Therefore, even though it's not objective, we're just going to act like it is?
No, it's not objective. I don't think anyone would argue that... Well, I think people would, but what I'm not proposing here is that universality is objectivity, but I think it's the next best thing.
Okay, it still sounds like we're talking about subjective ethics, though. So I don't see how.
Of course.
So I don't see how moral anti-realism has been swashed away here.
Oh, no, I was just saying that I'm a moral realist, and I was describing the sense I'm a moral realist, and I was saying that I don't think that I'm a moral objectivist, at least with what I've seen so far. I think I'm undecided on that specific question, but I can say that I assume everyone that I know of and can conceive of would prefer a system by which everyone can agree to on some level, rather than a bunch of systems that no one agrees to, where a serial rapist is equivalent to you or me.
I don't know if there is a system that everyone can agree to though, because you're gonna have like sociopaths and stuff.
Sure, but there are definitely traits. Well, I have one thing in specific, and you can tell me whether you dispute this or not. But I think this is true of all people. Um, I think that all people want their desires to be respected. Or to be a little more specific, people have desires and wish to have those desires manifested.
Sure,
Right?
I agree with that.
So then I would look at it as a case of how exactly do we look at all these actors and figure out a way by which we can help their desires? Because ideally, we'd want to help their desires. And so, while there's not a perfect method by which we can do this, I think a fairly good method that I'd argue normatively and meta-ethically is one by which we can, I guess, sort of make it to where people are all having their autonomy respected specifically. Because if it's just a case of all actors have desires and want their desires to be respected, then we have a universalizable trait. And so the best thing we can do is try to work on manifesting that trait among people, or rather, manifesting those desires. And when you take into account other people, you're trying to take into account how exactly you manifest your desires without basically stepping on theirs. Like, that's the way I look at it.
So, can I ask why you value autonomy more than like well-being or happiness or something like that?
Because I don't think you can have I don't think you can have well-being or happiness without autonomy.
Um, I don't know, because you could be like, let's say that you are completely paralyzed, but you're getting pumped full of like the best drugs there are. You could still be happy without being able to interact with the world around you.
Yeah, but you would be assuming there that you want to be happy, for example. And if someone wants to be happy and is enjoying those things, they desire those drugs. And if they desire those drugs, then it's just still them desiring, specifically them desiring happiness or well.
Yeah, but it's a desire that's been separated from their autonomy.
Yeah, but you're just not maybe not emphasizing, but you're still acting on their desires, specifically the desire to be happy or to enhance well-being. So you're still just looking at desires independent of the context.
Well, the way
I mean, yeah, their like legs are broken. They didn't choose to get like their legs broken or paralyzed or what have you.
Well, the way you just worded it kind of makes it sound like well-being is a higher value, because this is a person who, let's say I don't even know who they are, and they have no autonomy anymore because they're not able to interact with the world around them. However, under my system, I am deciding that, okay, I'm sure this person would probably want to be happy. Most people want to be happy. So it seems like in the absence of autonomy, I'm still making a decision based on one other factor. And that seems weird to me.
I don't think people want to be happy or have their well-being enhanced all the time, though. And we're still just evaluating, like when you watch a scary movie, or I guess when a kid has found out about horror films, they want to watch horror films. They're not watching the horror film to be happy. A lot of the times they're watching the horror film because they like the anxiety attached to it. They like the trepidation and the way the fucking bumps at the bumps in the night scare the fuck out of them. But they're not enjoying something about some type of happiness. They're enjoying the feeling of excitement,
Well,
specifically that attached to anxiety and what have you.
So the way I would argue against this is I would point out that most of these desired feelings are eventually reducible to happiness. So a person who watches a horror movie, they might not be directly feeling happiness, but the excitement, the adrenaline, all that they feel when they're watching a horror movie eventually leads them to feeling better than, or at least it's part of their desire to manifest some sort of positive emotion, which I would argue reduces the happiness. So like I don't watch a horror movie because I want to be miserable. I don't watch a horror movie because I want to make my life worse. I watch it because I get some sort of enjoyment out of it. Now this might be one step removed, but I eventually do get enjoyment out of it.
Do you think someone who wants to kill themselves is like becoming happy as a result?
No, I think that they're making an irrational decision.
Okay, wait. So why exactly are they are you saying we should disallow people from killing themselves?
In most cases, I would argue that this is one of my more
Okay, in what
extreme
cases would
views.
you not?
Um, I would say that if they are passing some sort of suffering threshold where there is absolutely no chance of like improving their situation to being like that of the average person, then at that point it's probably okay to let them kill themselves. For example, if you're going to live the rest of your life in pain and there's no painkillers that can help you, there's no surgery that could help you, yeah, it's probably okay to let that person kill themselves.
Okay, so let me give you a weird hypothetical, and maybe you'll see why this might be a little weird. If I like raped you once a month, but like 29 days otherwise, you got to just hang out and do the stuff you normally do. Would you be okay with like that? Do you think you'd be allowed to kill yourself, or do you think you'd be a bad person for killing yourself?
Well, it's not a matter of being a bad person, it's a matter of being irrational. So in this case, the trauma that I am feeling from being raped would be overriding my all my enjoyment from all the other days. Now, in this example, I'm assuming I'm being raped for the rest of my life. However, I'd argue that in a real world scenario, you'd have to operate under the assumption that this person is irrational because their situation could improve.
Well, I'm asking you to make a moral evaluation of this. Like, what do you say morally of the person who's killing themselves?
I don't really make a moral evaluation of people who commit suicide. I make a moral evaluation of people who let them commit suicide.
Well, no, because that's a weird thing. Why would you remove morality from their action? They're making an action. You, as a consequentialist, should be evaluating the consequences of that action. Would you say Amanda Todd, for example, is a bad person because she caused other people to potentially commit suicide and also emotionally disturbed her family? Would you consider her a bad person?
I don't remember enough about her situation. Wasn't she the one who was like bullied or something because of like some like online like revenge porn or something?
All, yeah, basically. But all you need to know is she killed herself. You know, it emotionally disturbed her family, and oftentimes it happens with suicides, especially ones that are televised, or maybe not in her case televised, but are publicized and mentioned very frequently. These tend to oftentimes inspire more suicides. So, would you consider her a bad person? Because in a consequentialist view, you would. For her basically desiring to end her suffering, you would consider her a bad person as a consequentialist. I wouldn't.
Well, no. Well, here's where I'm a little bit different, because I actually view like when you're judging the action and the consequences, you have to separate between consequences you could foresee and consequences that are coming completely out of nowhere. For example, if I were to throw a rock in a random direction because it makes me feel good, helps me get rid of some anger or something, but then that rock just bounces off like 30 or 40 different objects and like knocks over something that causes like a domino effect that causes a book to fall on somebody's foot. I wouldn't say that I'm evil for throwing that rock. Negligent, maybe. How in Amanda?
But you're supposed to be evaluating the consequences of the action. If you're not doing that, then you're being a non-consequentialist by doing this. You're choosing something other than consequentialism.
Well, no, because in that case, then rule utilitarianism is not necessarily a consequentialist viewpoint. Because under rule utilitarianism, you would occasionally make decisions that in the short term would cause more worse consequences under the idea that possibly in the future it eventually prevents even worse consequences. You can't know for sure that that's going to happen.
There's an epistemological problem with rule utilitarianism that reduces it to basically act utilitarian. So I wouldn't really say that's like a good way to use it. And even then, what rule would you be using to basically say, yeah, a girl killing herself would in the long term be a good thing? Like if we're mentioning that it might actually inspire more suicides, and say just for the sake of it that it did, you'd still have to evaluate that. And just knowing that suicide, when publicized, tends to inspire more suicides makes those people who've committed suicide bad people.
So I would say that if you commit suicide under the idea that your suicide could be publicized, then yes, that would there would be a very small degree of evil to that.
Yikes.
Well, you would say like, okay, let's say you're a parent and you commit suicide, leaving your kid to take care of himself. You wouldn't say that there's evil to that.
No.
All right, I think. See, this is one of the weird situations I end up with when people are defending suicide. Is it seems like there's so many weird, reducible situations that could lead to long.
I don't know, dude. I don't know if in any situation I would want to morally reprimand someone for being so fucking pained by living that I'd consider them a bad person. Those people aren't people that I consider in any way evil. Those are people I consider worthy of help.
Well, you wouldn't argue. All right, let's take it one step removed then. Let's say another person was in the room when this person was going to commit suicide. You wouldn't say that person is evil for not preventing them from committing suicide?
If, for example, a rape victim wants to kill him or her theirself, I'm not going to fucking freak out because someone tried to convince them and they failed, for example. I think if someone doesn't, right, doesn't try at all, I'm going to assume that in some way there's like something wrong with them, but I'm not going to assume they're a bad person.
Wait a minute. Okay. Do you remember the example I brought up with, what's his name? Unwound Toast?
No, what was it?
Okay, so, I asked Unwound Toast if somebody was going to commit suicide and you knew for a fact that if they waited 30 seconds they'd change their mind, are you morally obligated to stop that person from committing suicide? Well, if I ask you this question, then in order for you to say that they are morally required to prevent them, you'd have to appeal to some consequentialist framework.
No.
All right, then how can you say that you would be required to prevent them from committing suicide?
Wait, in the case you just brought up, you brought up two different cases. And the case that, as far as you're aware, someone is going to commit suicide and wants to commit suicide, and you don't really do anything, I think this might be indicative of you having some potential morality and might need some psychiatric help. But I wouldn't consider this a necessarily evil action. Now, in the case that you specifically brought up, if you know that for whatever reason someone is overcome with the urge for all of maybe 30 seconds to want to kill themselves, and you are also ordained with the knowledge to know that for the rest of their life they will be healthy, you can actually just consider that a moment where they're not actually understanding the ramifications of what they're doing, right? If you have this knowledge, you have a greater autonomy than they do, and they are not considered autonomous by the second form of autonomy that I laid out earlier, which is to know the consequences of your action. If they don't know that in the next 30 seconds they're not going to want to commit suicide and everything's going to be fine and dandy, but you do, you understand the consequences better than they do, and so of course it's okay for you to, take what means you need to in order to preserve their autonomy. This is why I brought up the conceptions of autonomy earlier. It was a way to avoid weird problems.
All right, so the problem I'd have here is I would argue that pretty close to everybody who commits suicide is doing so from an irrational point of view where they might not be considering the consequences of their actions. So I would argue that the person who is being more rational there has an obligation to step in.
Um, yeah, I think most people recognize that when someone's dealing with something psychological, there are oftentimes remedies. These remedies can be a social consideration. People treat these people better. People try and be there for these people. More specifically, like familial and platonic help. Also, there's definitely resources. Like, but if someone in a third world country, so just imagine some like fucking downtrodden third world country wants to kill themselves, and it's because they've been turned into a sex slave for a long time, and they've seen their parents get murdered or whatever. I'm not gonna fucking sit there and be like, yeah, everyone who sees this person can say with a great degree of certainty that this person could be helped. Now, would they ideally be helped? Yeah, but there are instances in which you cannot be asked to do something because you don't know the ramifications. You don't know that in the long term this person might be better. In the case that you propose, though, you know that it is the case that they're going to be fine afterward. It's for whatever reason just a 30-second urge, right?
Yeah, I'd argue that describes most cases of suicide, but okay.
Yeah, I think in most cases you do have an obligation. That's what I was saying. I think that in most cases you can say people are aware that there are resources, right? Resources that are social or maybe governmental. There are resources that I feel like most people would be aware of that can help people. I think it's only in instances in which people aren't aware of there being resources or don't think there are resources or know that there are no resources can you be like that person is excused in being inactive and someone being suicidal. Like if you were to tell me right now I'm suicidal, I'm going to be like, hey man, let's talk about it, let's talk about why. We can get a suicide hotline, here's the number. Like I can give you a variety of things that I know with at least a strong degree of certainty are able to help you in some way, right?
Well,
I don't know that in the case of someone like in a third world country. I know that in the case of the person you're telling me about.
well, if we're arguing that there's an obligation, then shouldn't we be arguing it's an ethical obligation so that if somebody doesn't fulfill that obligation, then they're to some degree evil?
No, I use the terms rational and irrational. So I think when it's the case that someone is being, I think there are cases where you can be evil in doing that. Like if you're to tell me you're suicidal, I'm going to commit suicide in 5 seconds if someone doesn't talk to me, and I go silent. And I know there are resources that can help you. And I just say nothing and let you like shoot yourself on live stream. That's fucking evil. But if you don't know this, or if you don't know how to deal with this, or what have you, and there's like a ignorance there, and you just have no real method by which you can understand of helping someone, then you can't really be considered evil, can you? Like I wouldn't be mad at a construction worker for not knowing how to, I don't know, like build planes, for example.
I think like when we're assuming that people don't have the knowledge that there's ways to fix their situation, we're kind of like assuming something that like we're kind of like building it up so that it's easier for you to it just seems like in most cases that people commit suicide, they do know that there are ways that they can be helped, and it seems like there usually are people out there who could have helped their situation. Seems like if we're gonna argue that like nobody's evil in all of this, it seems.
No, I think there are people that are evil, but I just think of Hanlon's razor. Like I think a lot of the times it's not that people are being some sort of evil. I think it's a lot of the times that people just don't understand or just don't know stuff.
Well, it is hard to assign moral value to stupidity.
Yeah, that's why I consider it a matter of irrationality versus rationality, because it fails to meet the criteria of rationality. So I think, again, going back to the case of the girl who's gonna commit suicide if you don't do something, but it's only for 30 seconds that she has this urge. I think that she doesn't understand the ramifications. She doesn't meet that second level of autonomy.
Well, would you argue that because of the resources that are available out there, in almost all real life cases, where somebody's going to commit suicide, they're acting as an irrational agent that should be have somebody step in and do something about it?
I think in the first world that most suicide cases that have that I've personally seen on like television and what have you, where it's someone who's been like bullied or something, or someone who has just dealt with like a severe grief. I think that other people around them have a moral obligation to try and assist these people, and also to try and make sure that they don't act on these impulses without, at the very least, trying to service themselves by accepting this level of assistance, and the community trying to help them. Like, I think if these people are accepting this communal support, I think that's like something that has to be done before someone can commit suicide. And I think it's like a rational thing. Like, if you've been fucking suffering from depression for like 50 years, right? And everything you've tried has failed. Pills have failed. Psychiatric help has failed repeatedly. Therapeutic help has failed repeatedly. You don't have a family. You don't have friends. Everything you've tried has failed. You've read every fucking self-help book you can get yourself adjusted with. Then I'm not going to say you're irrational. It seems to be the case that in that instance, which is pretty much a rarity, at least I've never heard of something like this happening very often. In an instance like that, that seems like a rational suicide. And that sounds almost oxymoronic, but I wouldn't fucking say like this person was just being stupid. This person didn't really know what was going on. Based on all the available information, it seems like nothing was going to get better. So I wouldn't blame them.
So I think how I would describe that situation is sort of like, I would still say that they're irrational, but I would say they would make the same choice if they were rational. So the action itself could be rationally justified.
Well, I think it's rational because if they know that the resources they've had access to have failed every time, and have failed for so long a time, that to say that they should continue on is like saying like a fucking paralyzed man should keep trying to walk. I can't like blame them for committing suicide, right?
Well,
like I wouldn't blame any suicide victim, I guess, but I mean specifically, I wouldn't call them irrational. Like, I'd consider Amanda Todd irrational, right? But I wouldn't consider someone who's just never been able to make things better irrational.
Well, like, when I'm talking about irrational, I think, like, it could be argued that chemically, in this case, they are irrational. Like, just in terms of the fact that they're acting under a situation where their body's not producing enough serotonin and dopamine. They're not, and they're acting entirely based on a very extreme emotional state.
Yeah, and I would agree, but if all the medicines they've had access to, or I guess all the prescriptions specifically they've had access to so far, have failed in assisting their emotional state, it's been that case for years. I just don't see why you'd say this person is rational for continuing to keep on when everything fails repeatedly, including medicine.
Well,
like, I think you have to exhaust your resources before you can commit suicide, and it can be considered rational. But I don't think a case where you've exhausted every fucking medicine you have access to, and then wanting to commit suicide because they've all failed, is irrational.
Well, all I'm doing is drawing a distinction between a rational person and a rational action. I agree that the action is rational, but like, I don't know, if somebody's like in an extreme emotional state, it becomes hard for me to argue that they're making rational decisions. Because like,
I don't know if they've. I guess it would depend on whether they've reasoned it this way. Like, if it's just, damn, I feel bad. I'm gonna kill myself. It's been 50 years. I feel bad. But if it's like everything I've tried so far has failed me, and I'm still waking up every day in a malaise, and nothing seems to work, and my life's a fucking mess, and everything I try is more. I think like obviously matter of rationality, the consequences of their action.
I was roboting on you for the last few words.
Oh shit! I was just saying, if someone is simply looking at their life and like, damn, I feel bad, and just kills himself, I think this is different than my life's in a malaise. Everything's fucked up. Everything I try seems to just never fucking work. Um, the latter being reasoned, is something I think is sufficient enough to be considered autonomous, because they're really weighing out the consequences.
Sure, I think the issue is like uh, trying to figure out how to word this. Like, if somebody is, you don't think like if somebody's like in a state of mind that they're having trouble evaluating things, then even if the thing that they evaluate turns out to be entirely rational, that because of that state of mind that they were in to begin with, they could still be considered an irrational person making a rational decision. I mean, this wouldn't change my view on whether it's moral or not. This is just a distinction that bugs me.
Wait, can you rephrase the?
Okay, basically what it boils down to is, do you think irrational people can make rational choices?
Yeah.
Okay, would you say that those choices carry with them, like, the rational choices do not suddenly become irrational just because the person who's irrational made them?
Yeah, because I think I like basically just the suicidal person I was describing. Obviously, them being suicidal itself is reflective of an irrationality, but the rationality of their decision is coming in the examination of their life, and how the constant malaise, the perennial malaise, is unextinguishable. Um, I think that they are making a largely rational decision, given the available circumstances.
All right. And you would say, like, the person who stops them from committing suicide without knowing how long they've been trying to commit suicide, would you say that person is acting rationally?
Wait, so in which case, like, what's the case of the suicidal?
All right. Well, we're still going with the guy who, like, he tried absolutely everything. Like, if somebody were to stop this guy from committing suicide, is that person evil for doing so? Because this guy is making a rational choice to commit suicide.
If someone comes in and just sees a random guy trying to commit suicide, and they like run and grab the gun from him and like wrestle it out of his hand and tell him like, no man, don't fucking hurt yourself, I don't think this person is bad. No.
All right. So when it comes to suicide, for me, the way I would consider it justifiable is if it's like this really drawn out decision, like you've gone to therapy, you've talked to people and everything, and then like basically at that point the society around you has been like, okay, this person has tried everything, maybe we should just let this person die. That's the point where I would consider suicide to be allowing someone to commit suicide to be morally neutral. The issue I have with it, though, is that in most cases, it seems like there is an obligation to prevent suicide. Now, when I argued this with Unwound Toast, he took the most absurd position imaginable, where suicide is always a rational, or is always a choice that should be respected in all cases. But it seems like you and
Yeah,
me.
of course not. Yeah, like like I said, mine or specifically my ethical system is Kantian inspired, but I think there are certain flaws that are attached to Kantian renditions of or a Kantian rendition of deontology, and mine is still rule based and all. But obviously, I understand that there are certain nuances that must be taken care of that I don't think Kant particularly addresses well. And that I think other people haven't done super well. So, like, obviously, I'm not going to agree with a guy who read a little bit of Kant and thought he had it all figured out.
Yeah, so it sounds like even though we had some, even though we've been arguing for this while, it doesn't sound like our positions are actually that different from each other.
Yeah, because my thing is, I think you can reach good conclusions, and I think most people would agree to the conclusions I come to. Um, all the while, you don't have to make it to where you could, in a very potential case, defend rape or defend slavery. Like, my problem is if you're looking at it through the lens of maximizing well-being, you could defend raping like 1,000 women a year to save the, I don't know, save the rapes of 10,000 women. Because if we rape 1,000 women a year for a psychology study, we could figure out how exactly to criminologically assign certain characteristics to the rapist. Blah blah blah. Now we can save 10,000 rape victims or potential rape victims, I guess. Or if it's a matter of just minimizing suffering, then you would just have to end up justifying the death of all of humanity. Whereas my thing is just, I don't think people want to be raped, so I wouldn't fucking rape anyone. And, well, no, you can't, because, like, rape's unconsensual. So, I wouldn't be cool with rape. And also, I wouldn't be cool with, like, all of humanity dying because, like you were saying earlier, you don't want to die. I don't want to fucking die. I don't think really anyone wants to fucking die except, like, suicidal people. You know, people who have it rough, unfortunately. So I just thought, it's the case that it's just easier to respect desires. It's a more efficient way of examining things. Obviously, the interesting part is how exactly you respect competing desires.
Well, in that case, I would go for the desire that maximizes as many people's well-being as possible.
Well, I guess I don't know, because the thing with well-being is you can show instances in which you might be okay with, like, well-being. Like, when you eat junk food, that's negative well-being, or at least that's more of a negative well-being than eating, like, I don't know, a very well-balanced diet. But I'm not going to go, you're a fucking, like, bad person, or at the very least say you're you're committing a bad action because you're eating, like, a Hot Pocket, right? Well, I guess I might because of, like, vegan-related reasons. I might say, like, that action, I don't know if it's necessarily morally okay. But, I mean, like, if you were to eat, like, a Hot Pocket and, I don't know, say it's homemade, it's, like, independent of, like, cruelty or whatever, but it's going to, like, hurt your fucking, like, your health. I'm not going to go, yeah, that's a bad thing to do. But if you're happy, that itself also isn't necessarily, like, a good reason, right? Like, if me raping a random person makes me more happy than it makes them suffer because, I don't know, say they were asleep, I'm not going to be okay with, like, raping people now. I'm not like Bill Cosby, right?
Well, I would say that like, I actually would assign some evil value to, like, the companies that try to market, like, unhealthy food to people.
No, I definitely would, because I think they're being deceptive, and I think being deceptive is bad. But I wouldn't, like, say you saying I understand that's gonna hurt my health, but I'm eating one hot pocket, and I haven't eaten fucking junk food since like 2017. I just want to try a hot pocket. I'm not gonna go, that's still bad, because technically speaking, it's a worse consequence than just simply eating your normal diet, assuming your diet's healthy, right? but that's not like a bad thing. I mean, it might be consequentially, but I don't think it's a bad thing.
Well,
Just because it impacts your well-being a little more negatively.
I think the issue in this sense is you have to make a decision based on incomplete information. For example, is the happiness I get from eating this Hot Pocket going to outweigh the happiness I get if I was more healthy from not eating the Hot Pocket?
Yeah. Say you know these two things. Say you know for a fact that eating this Hot Pocket will not like impact your health in any significant way because you're eating one Hot Pocket and it's the only Hot Pocket you're ever going to eat. The Hot Pocket, right?
Yeah, well, if we assume that I know all the variables, then that basically my decision's going to come out like an equation. The problem is I think an ethical framework needs to kind of contend with the idea that you won't know all the variables.
Well, that's the problem of consequentialism, yes. But I think a little more specifically, what I'm just trying to get at is, if it's the case that you're looking at it as a matter of maximizing well-being, I'm assuming here isn't just defined as you being happy. Because if it's just you being happy, then it's just happiness, and we can get into the problems of why happiness isn't necessarily the best thing to look at when you're examining moral traits.
So, well-being is kind of hard to define, but I would define it as positive emotions, positive health, and the ability to. I guess I could throw in like autonomy basically, because although autonomy kind of ties into happiness, so I don't even know if I need to throw that in. So yeah, it'd be.
Yeah, I think you can. I think you can make decisions without being happy. That can still be like morally okay, right?
Well, like
that's like why I'm going to say desire is greater than happiness.
Well, that just ends up into a weird situation. Like let's say that there's this dude Bob. You can make two choices for him. He can either live his life happy with very limited freedom, or he could be incredibly depressed but become omnipotent. Which would you rather happen to Bob?
I don't know. I mean, if he's incredibly I'd rather him be omnipotent because he could just like omnipotent away his fucking depression.
All right. Let's assume that there's no rule loophole here for you to exploit. Let's assume that like he's always going to be depressed no matter what he does.
We'll just assume he's like super powerful, but for whatever reason, a property of his is just being depressed. Okay, I don't know. I would assume that he doesn't want to be fucking depressed, and so in that case, I'd want him to be happy because that's what he wants, and it doesn't hurt me in any way.
Well, the issue I have with that is because it sounds like your highest value is autonomy, but you just maximized his well-being instead of his autonomy.
Wait, does he want to be depressed, or I thought he wanted to be happy.
Well, you're making the decision for him. You can't talk to him. He doesn't know you exist, and he doesn't know that his fate is in your hands.
Yeah, so the best thing I have to go off of here is what I know of most people, and what I know of almost everyone that I've ever met is that they want to be happy for the most part. Like, I'm sure at some points he'd want to be sad, right? I think there are points where people want to be sad. Like, I don't know. Have you ever seen the movie Inside Out?
No, but I'm aware of the premise.
Yeah, so there's a part in that movie that I think kind of speaks to the human psychology very interestingly. Specifically, there's a character in there that's modeled after sadness, and the revelation that comes at the end of the film is, damn, maybe it is okay to be sad sometimes. Maybe it is okay to want to be sad. Maybe being sad can actually be okay, because maybe sadness is something that's necessary for people to be ultimately fulfilled. And like personally, I'm okay. Like I will watch things that'll make me really sad, because I enjoy the embrace of empathy. I enjoy getting to know things. Like, it doesn't make me happy reading about how the Holocaust happened. That's fucking horrific. It doesn't make me happy at all to know that people were fucking killed, whether it be through war, through some type of ethnic persecution. It doesn't make me happy to know that there was just the Christchurch shooting, right? Or to watch the video or anything like that. It doesn't make me happy to do any of that. But what it does give me, it gives me a greater insight as to the things I shouldn't do. Here, I'm choosing to be more knowledgeable, both emotionally and historically, and also politically, as opposed to just simply being happy. Because I'm willing to sacrifice happiness sometimes.
Well, like I would argue that when we want to be sad, that's just because in a long way it brings us future happiness.
I mean, I guess you can do that, but isn't that just like a weird thing that's like saying you could, well, sorta, but even if that were the case, like, could you not choose a life where you're just not happy but get something else in return? Like, I could theoretically choose a life where I get to be the most knowledgeable person on earth without being happy. Being happy doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be sad or anything. You could be emotionally despondent. There are plenty of people who want to be emotionally despondent. That's why there's that like weird obsession with like sociopathy, because a lot of people think being emotionally despondent would be like a really cool thing.
Well, I would argue that's irrational, but the issue.
Yeah, but even then, people choose irrational things that will not make them happy, and they're aware that it wouldn't make them happy, but still would want to do those things.
Yeah, but like there's occasions where you're going to want to prevent someone's irrational opinion or irrational action. Like let's say somebody is just repeatedly kicking a wall until his foot is just like bleeding all over the place. Like it seems like okay, maybe this person would be better off if they were happy or something like that.
I mean, this is my thing, right? I get that a lot of these people would be irrational, but my idea is that I'd rather it be the case that we look at what's more universally applicable. So I think there are instances in which people choose their desires over being happy and end up doing stupid shit, but I don't think that's always the case. Like, I don't think boxing, for example, is something you're going to be very happy in. You fucking cut oftentimes dozens of pounds within a 3 to 6 month span. You get hit in the head repeatedly. You get fucking choked out in MMA, for example. And you do so many things detrimental to you, and oftentimes not for very good money. And these things don't really make a lot of these people happy, but they still do them because they think it's something to fulfill their existence. It's that search for meaning over happiness.
Well,
because I think and I guess you could try and make it roundabout and say, well, meaning ultimately is just an expression of happiness, but then you could technically just define anything as happiness, which is like a weird way to do it because you're saying like in being sad you're being happy, which is just being oxymoronic.
well, no, because the reason why you'd argue sadness is good is because it creates more future happiness down the line. Like if you're sad at a funeral, it's like it's this weird thing. Like it has to do with like the way your brain handles chemicals, like serotonin, but like you make yourself depressed later on when you think about how happy you are at a funeral. And that's something that people would try to avoid.
I mean, I don't know. My thing is just you can get a more universalizable trait among people by looking at desires. Because I think certain people desire, like, it's basically just the suicide thing. Like, people commit suicide knowing they literally will have no chance at happiness once they're dead.
I mean,
right?
Yeah, but like,
we agreed there are rational there are not very many, but there are rational cases there are rational cases in which you can commit suicide, right?
Sure.
And if that's the case, it'd just be better to look at desires, because it's not a matter of happiness; it's a matter of desire at that point. Well, a very sad desire, nonetheless, but a desire still.
Well, the issue I have with that is because you're looking at what will be the simplest solution rather than what is necessarily the best solution. And the best, what I would argue would be the best solution, is a lot more complicated. So, if we were always going to look at people's desires, then well, like even you kind of like go against that when like you have like white supremacists, they want black people to be deported or killed or something. That's a desire that we're not like going with because it causes
Yeah,
long-term
because we
harm.
have. Yeah, but it's not just about happiness there, right? Like, my thing is, you can have cases which are independent of some happiness gain, but what you're ultimately still looking at is just desires, right? And when you're looking at competing desires, so black people in the United States who want to stay, and white supremacists who want to, or I guess whatever the fuck you want to call them, uh, people who are nationalistic and want to remove a lot of ethnic minorities. Um, this isn't like the same thing as someone having a happiness factor removed. It's different because there is specifically still desires. It just so happens to be the case that the specific desire here is for both happiness and also, obviously, self-preservation.
Yeah, I think this like the issue is it sounds to me like you don't want to value like well-being because it leads to like a lot more complicated situations.
Well, I care about well-being, but I care about well-being insofar as like I myself care about well-being. I know other people care about well-being. I know, for example, you care about well-being. Um, and I know you desire to have a betterment of your well-being, and I think that's the case for most people I know, right? Um, so I don't treat it as like some weird case in which like most people shouldn't care about well-being. I think people should care about well-being because it's like what we're oftentimes caring about, right? I just think that when you're looking at what's more universally preferable, and probably the most universally preferable thing, it would just be people have desires and people want their desires to be respected. And it's very similar to what Jean-Jacques Rousseau outlines, like the social contract. Similar in the sense of you give up certain liberties in order to have your liberties protected. Um, so you might not fucking like you might not like let a white supremacist be able to take over the United States and kick out all the black people, but you're probably not going to let this white supremacist get like ass raped by a bunch of like random people either. I'd imagine, at least.
Sure, I think like functionally, like as how I'd have society would work sounds very similar to what you're arguing for. But I think
Yeah, we don't have like a major disagreement on like most of the conclusions we're arriving at.
yeah, it's just like I think like ethics is more than just like how you want society to run and more like what is the ideal most ethical or ideal way that you would have society be if you could like in terms of like how does ask yourself put it the reductio. So basically, like, what would be the ideal society? And for me, the ideal society would be one that promotes people's well-being. Now, I will agree that functionally I need to respect their intentions because I don't always know what is going to lead to their well-being. But that's just me making a compromise for the real world that we live in.
Of course. I mean, my thing is just I'm trying to figure out a case in which you could have a preference that is applicable to as many cases as possible. And you agree that there are cases in which you can make a decision that is moral, independent of there being any happiness improvement. And you basically said that you thought that well-being was more or less just like happiness. And I guess you defined well-being to also include autonomy, but that's like what I'm arguing is pretty much the most important thing anyway.
Well,
So if the yeah,
well, no, I would argue that people are happy when they feel like they have freedom.
yeah, I would suppose so, but I don't think the person who's on. I don't know. My thing is just if you admit there are cases in which you can do something independent of being more happy as a result, specifically suicide, and you admit that there are rational suicides, then I don't see how exactly you're going to say that it's better to go with the thing that's less applicable. Like, why is it better to go with the thing that's less applicable?
Well, like in the case of suicide, I would say it's a rational suicide if there's virtually no chance that
Hmm.
their well-being to suffering ratio is going to be positive in the future. So it doesn't seem like I'm changing my axiom here.
Yeah, I guess what I'm just trying to get at is just how exactly do you have happiness without like desires?
Well, like people, their desires generally relate to their happiness, I guess.
Yeah, but I'm just wondering, like, what situation can you think of where you can be happy independent of desires?
Um, drugs.
What do you mean?
I mean, shit, what was the name of that science fiction book where the entire society was drugged up? Uh,
There are a few of those.
well, like, I wish I could remember the name of it. But, like, let's say you had a society where everybody is drugged without even like realizing it, so that they're always happy, they're always feeling good. This is happiness that they're obtaining outside of their autonomy.
I mean, don't these people want to be happy then?
Sure, but I would argue pretty close to everybody wants to be happy, and when they don't want to be happy, it's either because they're valuing happiness further down the line, or they're just being irrational.
Yeah, sure, but I still don't get like in what instance you can have happiness independent of autonomy. I like the example you gave me was basically saying like they're not informed about every part of what exactly is occurring, so they're not exercising the second level of autonomy. But on a more basal level, they still are desiring to be happy, and they are having that desire satisfied. I still don't see a circumstance in which you can have happiness independent of desires.
Shh. All right, well, it sounds like you're reducing autonomy to happiness, which is weird because then it seems
Well,
like
I think you can have desires without happiness, but I don't think you can have happiness without desires. That's like what I'm
well,
trying to
no.
say.
Well, I gave you the the situation where you're drugged. Like, and this is something like they wouldn't desire to be drugged. Now, their desire to be happy is like a really base human desire. It's not something that they just decide, hey, you know what, I want to be happy. It's something that's like written into our code that we desire happiness.
Um, but that I don't know. That's weird though, because that's like saying, um, I want to have sex and don't want to have sex. Like it's a weird thing because what you're describing to me is an instance in which these people are happy, but you're not describing how exactly they don't want to be happy and also are happy.
Wait, you just gave me the perfect example. All right, let's say you're an asexual person with a sex drive. You will feel a desire to have sex. You will want to have sex, but you also don't want to have sex because you're asexual. There's some other reason why you don't want to have sex, so you have conflicting desires.
Yeah, you can have conflicting desires, sure, but I don't. How does it speak to having happiness without desires? I still don't get it.
Um, okay, so happiness without desires. Let's say you are in a coma and um, you are, I don't know, you're having the perfect, most awesome dream possible. You aren't conscious, so you're not able to formulate any real, like, well thought out desire. So you are still happy within the dream, but like you're not functionally like reasoning or doing anything like that people usually attribute to coming up with a like a desire. Like I think we're using the word desire here in like two different ways, so it's kind of weird. Like I would say
What
that.
do you mean by desire?
So I would say that I guess biological imperative is how I'm thinking about it in terms of happiness.
Well, I think you can. Yeah, I agree. You can have levels of desires, right? So, like, if I want to, like, and if I want to have sex really badly, but like I'm also religious, so I want to, prolong my fucking having sex with people until I'm married. Like, obviously, those are two conflicting desires. But what's ultimately going to matter more is which one I end up reasoning to be better, or which one I'm assuming to be better, or what have you, right? You can have conflicting desires. I agree. But I don't see any situation in which you could be happy and also not want to be happy.
Happy and not want to be. Well, you gave me an example earlier, like being at a funeral. If you're at a funeral, you expect to be sad, you want to be sad, but let's say you are happy anyway. That would be an example of you being happy, regardless of your. I just used the fake word. Regardless of your desire.
Well, no, because you like physically, or I guess specifically psychologically, want to be happy, right? And that's more whelming than your conscious decision to want to be sad in order to fit a societal norm, right? But that's the same as the religious person simply wanting to prolong them having sex, despite wanting to have sex. Like, it's just a more whelming desire, which ultimately prevails. That's it.
All right. So when you're using the word desire, are you using it in terms of conscious decisions or just like anything that your body wants?
All types of desires are considered here.
Okay, then.
So your biological will, your unconscious will, your conscious will, all of that.
All right, so it sounds like all right, and your contention was that I couldn't think of an example of somebody being happy regardless of their desires, correct?
Yeah, I still don't know of any situation in which you could do this.
All right, so I don't see what the issue is because even if we argue that these things are linked, functionally the way you value desire is very different from the way I value happiness in terms of like how a society should be run. So if we're going to say that they're linked, I'll just say that I value happiness as the emotion, even because that is like the most over or underlying desire that we have that overrides any conscious desire that we have. So like
yeah, and I would agree, but that would still reduce it down to it just being the most preferable desire, which I'd agree to.
Sure,
it tends to be the most preferable desire.
But if you agree to that, doesn't that lead you to my ethical view? Because if we're
no, because
well, if we're going to argue that it's the most preferable desire, which is happiness, then it should lead that, or at least not to my. It should lead to my axiom. It should lead that well-being should take higher precedence over any other aspect of autonomy.
Well, no, because that would still assume that I give a fuck about desires, which I do, obviously. I'd still have. It's like saying the most preferable way of getting like raped. Like, you don't want to get raped. You don't want to get raped. But if in the case of wanting to have a desire, it's like saying, well, what kind of ice cream do you like? The most preferable ice cream for me would be like pecan, maybe. I'd say, and you would like giving me ice cream would still be like cool, even if it's a less preferable ice cream.
Well,
but this would assume that I care about ice cream, right? I'd still have to care about ice creams more fundamentally.
Well, it sounds like you've been arguing that you value autonomy or people's ability to fulfill their desires. So, and now we're just, it sounds like we're kind of throwing that away.
No, I do care about people being able to fulfill their desires.
Okay, well, we just argued that the person's most fundamental desire is their well-being.
Um, well, wait, what? No, you said it
Uh,
was happiness and then well-being. Which one do you
well,
mean now?
well, no, happiness is a part of well-being. Like I define well-being as people's preferred emotion, which is usually happiness, as well as their ability to be healthy. And so, like, I would argue that if we're going to assign point values to desire.
Oh, I get what you're saying. Yeah, I was saying that the most preferable desire is happiness, but when I'm saying happiness, I mean like specifically the emotion that comes with people having their desires manifested. That's what I'm trying to say. That's
Sure,
why it came off a little weird.
sure, but you can be happy. Uh, you can be happy when your desires aren't being manifested. For example, let's say you desire to be, I don't know, a successful accountant, but like events in your life end up in you becoming a construction worker, but you really, really find that you're enjoying being a construction worker. You didn't fulfill your desire to become an accountant, but you're still
Well,
being
because
happy.
you have another desire there. You have a desire to be a
Yeah,
construction worker.
yeah,
And you're fulfilling that specific one.
yeah, but that's entirely an emotional reaction you get to an action that you didn't want to do.
Yeah, and well, sort of. So the thing is, you can still have a desire fulfilled there. Like you're still having desire fulfilled there. Does it mean
You kind of just roboted right there. Can you repeat what you just said?
cases you still have to have a desire that's being fulfilled? And I think at least, have yet to be presented a case in which you can be happy independent of a desire.
Well, well, the issue is because I consider happiness to be the highest form of desire. And earlier when I
Yeah, I agree. It tends to be the most maybe not useful, but the most fundamental desire for a lot of people.
okay,
But what I consider happiness to be, like I said, is just the satisfaction that comes from having your desires manifested or fulfilled.
okay, do you agree that in Deontology we can sort of like assign like rough point values to actions? For example, murdering something would be like 100 evil, raping someone would be 20 evil, smacking someone would be like 2 evil, something like that.
No, that's a consequentialist to you.
So you view all evil actions exactly the same?
No.
All right, so you do view some evil actions as being worse than others, correct?
Yeah, but that's not a reflection of my moral system. That's just a reflection of like a personal view that I have as a result of having a greater disdain towards some. Like for example, I consider rape to be worse than death, but these two things are obviously, maybe not obviously, but are roughly equivalent, right?
Wait, how do you determine that these are roughly equivalent?
By setting up a binary system. That's what a rule-based ethics would be, which is what deontology is, just
Okay,
rule-based ethic.
okay, so how are you arriving to the conclusion that the best rule is to define these two things as equally bad?
Well, maybe not equally bad, but it's not like you ever really weigh them. It's like a weird thing to do in a rule-based ethics. It's more like if you went, is the statement true or false? Whether X statement is true or false doesn't impact whether Y statement is true or false.
So it sounds to me like you personally hold higher levels of disdain to certain actions, but you do not assign more extra moral values according to your higher levels of disdain. But within your ethical system, it sounds like you're claiming every evil action is equally evil, but you're kind of trying to get around that through binary logic.
Well, because it is like binary. Like it's
Well,
just is this action a violation of autonomy?
well, like even in
Look at the
terms,
reasons. Yes or no? Yes. Like
e-
I don't see how you'd make you can make an equivalence there. Like are both actions both violations of autonomy? Yes.
like even in terms of binary logic, if we're saying, okay, so this is true, this is false, you can then assign another value on top of it. It's like, it just seems weird to me that you would state that something can be good, something can be evil, but never differentiate how good or how evil. It's like, within your system, me slapping someone in the face would have to be defined as true, which would be the same definition that you would give me murdering someone. So they'd be exactly the same in your worldview.
Not really. Like it's more like it's like it's almost like this. It's like if I went, is the question, did the Holocaust happen, have a numerical value? Like no, like probably not. It's more like that. Like the question you can't ask of basically something like, is this the case or is it not the case?
Wait,
Doesn't entail like a numerical value. That's like what I'm getting at. Like
wait,
you're asking a question that I don't think can really be asked of like a rule based ethic.
wait. I hate to accuse you of this, but you kind of just conflated something in a really weaselly way. You argue that ethics are kind of subjective, but then you compared it to something that is quite clearly fact-based and provable. So,
No, I never said ethics is subjective. I said the best case we have is that it's probably not knowable at the moment because I
okay,
don't know by what we would use to figure it out.
okay, there are methods I can prove that the Holocaust happened. What are methods you can prove that murder is wrong?
Deontological ethics.
Why does deontological ethics prove murder is wrong?
We can go ahead and go through the reasons, but specifically because it's a violation of the willingness to live.
Why is violating the willingness to live wrong? We're going to keep going until we get to solipsism.
You can actually go a little further than that, but what's your point here?
My point is, you have arbitrarily, or not arbitrarily, you have taken a presupposition that your ethical system is correct. And
But
then,
you do this with everything, though.
yes,
Like I
but
don't. You can do this with even the question of did the Holocaust happen?
all right. So the issue with that though is in terms of the presupposition made, there are, in order to operate in an environment, you have to go with the presupposition that certain your senses are correct. You have to assume solipsism is wrong. But the issue with ethics is there's no confirmation even within that assumption. For example, I can find evidence of the Holocaust within that presupposition. However, in order to work with an ethical theory, I had to throw another presupposition on top of that, in addition to the
So are
presupposition.
you like arguing all of mathematics is wrong
I'm arguing. No,
or subjective?
I'm
Because
arguing.
mathematics is just a series of deductions. Mathematics is just assuming this rule or assuming these particular postulates or what have you. You can infer this. Mathematics is about inferences, but you wouldn't fucking sit here and tell me that mathematics is a subjective phenomenon, would you?
No, but
Or
I can.
rather, a subjective study.
No, but I could propose a completely different system of mathematics that arrives to the same conclusions using different rules.
Yeah, you definitely could. This is what Gödel talks. Well, maybe not what Gödel talks about, but this is what like you can concern yourself. You can meet certain inferences without necessarily using the same exact rules. This is how and why people have been able to like write about Newtonian mechanics without using like modern mathematics or like the numerics we've built up. Sure, but you're still looking at a series of inferences, and you wouldn't sit here and tell me mathematics is subjective just because ethics is built off of a system of underlying assumptions, and then the inferences you can make from those assumptions. that doesn't invalidate it as being potentially objective. That just invalidates as
Wait, if we're talking about something
the
being
Holocaust happened.
if
But I would say that it's reasonable to say the Holocaust happened.
so if we're talking about something being potentially objective, why can't you apply that label to literally everything that is subjective?
No, I agree. Everything could be potentially objective. I don't know for sure that anything is definitely objective or definitely subjective. I'm very epistemologically skeptical.
So if we're going to argue that anything could be potentially objective, what value is there in saying that deontological ethics is potentially objective?
The value would specifically be that if we were to assume certain things that are built up under deontological ethics, then you can make inferences by which you can uphold values that have been assumed. Like, and I know exactly what you're wondering here.
Well, the issue is like you can apply that to any ethical system, and it just seems like,
You can. That's why you challenge presuppositions, which is what we've done.
it just seems weird to me. Like this leads you to this worldview that everything being good or evil is just true or false without any like without any like extra value being attached to it.
Well, because I think that well, I guess you technically could, but I think it's just a weird way to look at it. I mean, you like very technically could. I mean, like obviously, someone who accidentally steps on a piece of grass that for whatever reason blows up Antarctica and kills a bunch of polar bears isn't the same as like, I don't know, someone like serially raping people or serially murdering people or fucking being some sort of mass shooter. But I don't know, like obviously that's not the case. I'm not saying these two things are morally equivalent. What I'm saying is I just don't see the pertinence of this question. I don't think it's like worth asking. I don't see how exactly you'd even attach numerical value.
Well,
but if you're saying, can you make distinctions between these in terms of how much they matter? Yes, I just don't know how you'd quantify them. That's what I was saying.
well, like even if you don't have a way of quantifying them, you can still have like there could still be a higher value to something. For example, I have no way to quantify beauty, but I can say that one person is more beautiful to me than somebody else.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I never disagreed with that. Like I said, I just don't know what the pertinence of the point of saying that something could be more valuable than another thing. Like what that would be.
Well, the pertinence is because we beforehand we argued that what was it? Happiness is the highest level of value. So if we were going to go under the assumption that like there is an evil that should be avoided even if it requires allowing another evil to exist, which is something you could arrive at if you assign different values to different evil actions, then it would eventually lead to a maybe not necessarily utilitarian, but a sort of like it would lead to the same axioms as that I possess. Like you're free.
Well, that's what I said was consequentialist, and that's what I disagree with. I don't agree with the conclusion specifically being the arrival of rule utilitarianism.
Oh, okay.
Because there are instances in which I would say, for example, in the case of suicide, that it is a rational decision for someone to commit suicide. And while this is at the risk of happiness, I'm not gonna like fucking be mad at, say, some guy who's been living with suicidal depression for 50 years and has tried everything and nothing has worked. Okay. Simply because that would be better in most instances does not think that I think it is better in this particular situation, which a rule utilitarian would have to do. You would have to bite the bullet and say, force that man to suffer, when I think there's a better way of evaluating the situation pragmatically.
Okay, let's say I put a gun to your head and said, okay, there's a man in the room. I want you to either slap him or kill him. What do you do?
I'm going to slap him.
How did you arrive to that conclusion if both slapping and killing someone are both defined as evil under your ethical system?
I don't think they're both evil.
You don't think it's evil to slap someone?
No, I think it's a violation of autonomy.
Isn't that how you decide what is good and evil in your system?
No, because I think you can be irrational without necessarily being evil. Like I said, I think there can be more of something, and I think it's more emphatic to say something is evil. I already agree to that. What I was saying specifically is I was going to agree with your conclusion, which is just because you can say that someone, or that most people are going to want to be happy, and this is the more fundamental desire for most people, that it is the case that we should value happiness as the utmost thing, because this leads to things like forcing people to, I don't know, stay alive and they want to fucking kill themselves because they've been suffering. You could also potentially defend slavery in cases like this, and this also could just reduce down to us talking about utility monsters again. That's what I was saying. I disagreed. If I wasn't more clear, I'm specifically disagreeing with the conclusion you're making.
I mean, like, it seems like because you value autonomy, it seems like if you have any sort of axiom at all, it can be reduced to like some sort of a axiomatic
Desire.
monster.
What do you mean?
Well, like
you can reduce anything to absurdity? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, but like I don't personally view like when we were talking about the utility monster earlier, I argued that I didn't really see why it was a problem because it was consistent with how I'd view like us killing ants to save a life or something, a human life or something like that. Like it seems like it's pretty consistent.
Well, because we can go with more disgusting examples than that. Because when you try and paint it that way, it sounds a lot better. But if we were to just be a little more fucking clear about like what this could entail, say there's some fucking alien that comes down that's super powerful, but is also super sensitive to the emotion of happiness, and so like eating a cheeseburger would give him like an eternity of euphoria, and so he decides that he wants like multi eternities of euphoria. So the way he accomplishes this is by raping the entire fucking human race. That would maximize well-being beyond anything we could even fucking possibly comprehend. But I don't think that's a morally justifiable action. And if you were to say, well, I think it's about minimizing suffering, then I could say, well, do you think we should kill all people? And you're almost bound to say no. And I think most people would say no. And I think intersubjectively, it is the case that people would not agree to being raped by a fucking super sensitive alien cockhead, nor would people be willing to die because this would minimize suffering. I think people just want to do what they want to do and hope that can be respected and also fulfilled.
So, in the alien example, so assuming that he's getting like an infinite amount of happiness from his actions.
Magnitudes of infinity. It's some next level shit, dude.
Okay, so assuming that he's getting the magnitudes of infinite amounts of happiness, like from his point of view, he would be following my ethics. The issue is I also value self-defense. So I would say, like, and this is one of the few deontological values I have. So I would say that that anyone who he rapes is.
Where are you a threshold deontologist?
Nah, this would be like inverse threshold deontology or something bizarre like that. I don't even know what the term is.
Okay, well, so what you're saying is that you have a largely consequentialist system with a few deontological nuances. Okay.
Yeah, and Leo was questioning me about this on my server a while back, and he's like, oh, well, it seems like you also value virtue ethics, or like, I don't even know how my system is described. But
I actually have a friend who has a similar thing, but my question would then just be, by what ethics do you independently verify which is better in a given situation? Like, what ethical standard do you use to decide when deontology is better than consequentialism, or vice versa? Because you have to have some independent ethical standard of those two, because those two can't be used to self-justify when either one could be used to self-justify.
When it would require what I would define as martyrdom.
Wait, what?
When it would require martyrdom, that is when I take a deontological stance. So if somebody has to let themselves be raped, I would say that they're allowed to defend themselves.
Okay, no, but I'm asking what ethical standard are you using to independently verify which one of these systems would be better in a given instance than another?
Um, I would say
Because these two can't be used to self-justify anymore because they are now in direct contradiction.
no, because in this case, the deontological one would bear out. So, like I said, I'm kind of like a reverse threshold deontologist. So, if we're assuming that an individual has to allow a really high amount of harm onto their own self for the greater good, they would be entitled. I would say that they are entitled to take a stance against that. For example, if everybody, all right, here's the most fucked up thing you can get me to say. If everybody in the entire planet decided that I needed to die tomorrow, I would say it'd be entirely justifiable for me to kill the rest of the world in self-defense.
Okay, but I don't know. I'm still not getting how exactly you're choosing one system over the other. Like, why martyrdom specifically? Because telling me martyrdom because martyrdom is a principle of mine is just referring to deontology. But you can't use deontology such that it's self-justifying, given that you also use consequentialism, and they're in direct contradiction.
No, I would say that requiring martyrdom leads to long-term negative side effects in society. For example, if you require a situation where one person needs to willingly allow themselves to die in order to save 5 other people, the only types of people who are going to willingly make that sacrifice are probably the types of people you would have wanted to keep around anyway.
Yeah, but my question is just, why are you choosing deontology in some cases over consequentialism?
Well, I just told you. I think that if you don't take a deontological stance, it leads to a long-term negative consequence. So it's still like I still have a consequentialist justification.
But if you're using deontology and then you're using consequentialism to defend deontology, then
Wait,
you're also undermining both of your systems now.
no, this.
So I'm asking,
this is
like, what are you using to choose one over the other?
This is in terms of what would functionally work. So when I'm saying when I'm saying that somebody is able to, if they're required to martyr themselves for the greater good, but then they take a stance against that, I would argue that even though in this particular instance it would seem to make sense that for that person to allow themselves to be killed, if we allow that as a rule, it causes long-term problems. So it's still justifiable within utilitarianism. Does that make sense? Okay, it just showed you as speaking, but I didn't actually hear anything from your end.
Hello?
Alright, I heard you that time.
Yeah, I was saying that you're still using consequentialism to defend deontology, but you can't do that without basically giving to me an incoherent system of ethics.
No, because if you're going through that argument, I can argue that any individual action could be defended through a deontological lens. So you could argue that utilitarianism is just deontology, and that just leads to absurd situations. For example, if I argue that somebody can defend themselves in self-defense, you could argue, okay, that's a deontological stance because you're saying that as a rule, this person can disregard somebody else's well-being. Then you could argue, okay, well that's just deontological, and then and I could argue, I could make the same criticism of deontology. It just lends idea that none of these systems are defensible because you could argue them from a different system. It's weird.
Well, no, your specific problem is that you admitted you have two systems, and so
No.
these two systems can't be used to justify themselves, and these two systems can't be used to justify each other because they're the negation of one another.
Okay, so if I'm arguing that there is a long-term benefit to somebody taking a stance against martyrdom,
That's just rule utilitarianism. That's not a deontological view.
okay. Okay, so if we're going to say that's not a deontological position, then I don't know. It seems like the issue here is I said that I had a deontological value and I'm taking a stance against martyrdom, but I don't know. It seems like this was just a semantical error or something.
Maybe. Well, if it's not the case that you're undermining your system, then you were saying that you do hold it to, or you do hold the position that martyrdom can be cool in some cases, and you'd be willing to uphold this as a rule. Okay, so you were going with this?
Yeah, I think I just explained my reasoning why, but I'm actually kind of curious as to how you think having two ethical systems like causes them to contradict or whatever. Like threshold deontology is basically just that.
Yeah, I don't think threshold deontology is a very good system.
Well, you can say it's a very good system, but it seems like if the reason why you switch systems is because it hits some certain criteria and you're consistent within that criteria, then it doesn't seem like it contradicts.
Well, the thing I was drawing out specifically was you'd have to have an ethical standard that is independent of both of these systems, by which you can justify using a system and it's contrary. And I was wondering what specifically you would have as your independent method of verification here.
You mean, so you're asking me why I have chosen the frameworks I've chosen?
Yeah, in particular instances, why would you choose one instance over the other? What ethical standard did you use to decide one over the other? And you can't give me a consequentialist case
Wait.
because you've...
It seems like that question applies even if you just have one framework, because then the question is, why do you have that framework?
Yeah, and obviously you can get to a degree of circularity with any system, but your system is reaching an earlier level of circularity than mine would.
Well, like, why couldn't somebody defend their system through what's it called, emotivism or something, where they just argue that ethics are basically just a system of preferences?
You could totally do that if you'd like, but the problem in doing that is basically saying that someone getting fucking murdered is the same thing as, I don't know, someone getting like pushed down the stairs.
Well, no, you don't argue it's the same thing. You would just argue that neither one is objectively wrong. Or right, for that matter.
Yeah, these are just both preferences that are not had. These are effectively the same thing. They don't really mean anything.
All right, can I ask you, how come ethics has to be held to a higher standard than the ideas of beauty?
What do you mean?
Well,
what higher standard is it held to?
Well, beauty is like you have different people have different criteria through how they judge beauty, but it's often not like provable. For example, I can't prove that somebody is more beautiful than the other. I can't explain why I think somebody is more beautiful than the other. And at the very base levels, in terms of how I decide beauty, what is and what isn't beautiful, we could argue that beauty in itself is entirely a social construct. So when we're talking about ethics, we have to talk. It sounds like when I have to defend why killing is wrong, or why saying killing is wrong is just a subjective value, but I don't have to defend it when I'm saying somebody is beautiful is just a subjective value.
Well, what I was specifically getting, well, two things actually. So the problem I had wasn't even that you were saying it's subjective. That was somewhat it, but that was never really the original thing I was saying. What I was saying was, you're telling me one thing and then another. And so I was saying that if you're going to tell me one thing and another in different circumstances, is there some underlying standard by which you decide one over the other? And you could potentially just argue in favor of moral particularism, but I don't know how exactly you get across moral particularism in this case, and say that there's no principle in which you're adherent to, without basically running into a fucking huge set of other problems. But the other thing is, if you were to tell me beauty is defined by symmetry, right? And I showed you something asymmetrical, and you went, "That's ugly." And I showed you another thing that's asymmetrical, basically the same thing, and you went, "That's pretty." I'm gonna go, "Wait, why is this thing pretty?" And if you're like, "Well, because that other thing's ugly," or you tell me the other thing's ugly because that other thing's pretty, that's not gonna function well. That doesn't mean anything. Like, telling me this is the case because the other thing doesn't mean anything. So I would ask you, well, how are you deciding one over the other? How are you deciding that in this case it could be ugly, or in this case it could be pretty? And you're just telling me because of the other one. Much in the same way how you're telling me consequentialism is better in this case because, or rather, deontology is better in this case because of consequentialism. If you keep telling me that, that's not a real justification. Now, if you don't have a principled justification, you're a moral particularist, then you can say so, and that's fine. But
Well, I'm curious, what is your moral justification for deontology?
um, specifically, like a metaphysical way, or what?
Well, it sounds like you're asking me a question that seems like really vague and open-ended, so I'm not really sure how to answer it.
Oh, well, what I'm asking, right, is if you're gonna choose one over the other, either it's the case that you have a standard by which you can choose one over the other, or you don't have a standard. And so all I'm saying is, like, uh, if you're telling me that science is better than theology in explaining why evolution happened, and then when we're talking about evolution again, and you're telling me, well, on this specific part of natural selection, I think theology explains it better, and I go, why? And you just tell me, well, because evolution. That it sounds like that, or what I'm trying to get across is, you're telling me two different things, and they're very strongly in contradiction. And you're using them for different scenarios, and so I'm wondering, why exactly do you decide one for some type of scenarios and one for the other type of scenarios? If you tell me there's no standard for this, or there's no principle, or you're just doing it because it feels a little bit better, then we can reduce this to being more problematic. There are a lot of problems with you basically saying, well, I just think this is better. I'm cool with martyrdom because, well, I just like martyrdom.
Well, it sounds like you're asking me for the base presupposition through which I decide.
I'm not.
All right. Well, all right. So
How do I word this? I don't know. Like, it's the difference between saying fuck no, because every time I give an analogy, it comes out weirdly. No, it's literally just, you have two systems, and if you think the system can be better for one situation, and the other situation can be better for another situation, why? I'm not asking for your most basal presupposition. I'm just asking for your greater normative reason.
So, my greater normative reason would be because Well, like I thought we already concluded that like me saying that I take a stance against martyrdom was just role utilitarian, and it's not actually deontological principle. I thought,
Okay. Yeah,
but
that's
like,
okay.
but like so, but I still kind of don't think there's an issue. So just for now, let's use threshold deontology as an example. So let's say I'm a threshold deontologist and I hold two deontological values, but then one of those deontological values will require me to, I don't know, justify uh, genocide by inaction. So why would it be invalid for me to say, okay, the reason why I value deontology is because this seems to be a system where I don't know what's the justification they would use. Where
The libertarian justifications. Oh lord.
what's the libertarian justification?
The weird like deontological justifications of effectively no reconciliation of problems because lol you just have to be inactive. You
Or
just have to be inactive because that's a liberty.
okay, let's say the NAP. Let's say
Oh boy.
let's say I take a deontological stance because I don't want violence to be done to me, and I don't want a society where people are doing violence to each other. But somebody reduces my system to, okay, well, there's a situation where you'd have to allow a genocide by inaction. If I were to say something like, well, me saying yes to this would lead to this huge long-term system where there's fewer, like, let's say, I don't know, there's fewer people, way too few people would be alive to, I don't know, reciprocate my values. Like, I don't see, like, how there's a problem with that. Or even if I just said, this is my preference, I don't see how there's a problem with that either.
Wait, say that again? That last part?
Well, let's say, like, it's simply because I would prefer to not live in society where I would have to allow for some ridiculously horrible situation to happen, even if it doesn't contradict anything else that I've stated.
So does it just mean so for you the standard by which you choose the one system over the other is just it feels better? Like does it get like that fucking reductive that fast? Like if you were to ask me, right, why do you choose deontology over consequentialism in all cases? I would break down precisely why. And the beginning of this conversation was basically me explaining that I think there are there's at least one universalizable characteristic among people, and that's that they have desires which they wish to be satisfied. And I think building off of that, you could construct a system of inferences that understanding that people want their desires to be satisfied, and that ethics is oftentimes just exploring what desires we want to be satisfied. And then we are ultimately just looking at how exactly we deal with desires and specifically competing desires, and then I just construct up how you are examining rationality, as Kant put it, which is, of course, the respect for autonomy and the exercising of it. Like, that's how I'd build up the case for deontology over consequentialism, right?
Okay.
And I'm asking, like, what exactly you're using to build up consequentialism in one case over deontology, and then deontology in another case over consequentialism. And what you've told me now is that you would use it, or you would use the justification of, I just prefer it, when I think you could be a little more intimate than that.
Well, the issue is, it sounds like what you just gave me was one big presupposition, and I don't see like why the length of my reply in a presupposition makes mine less or better.
Because I think you're reaching a greater degree of circularity than I am, much more soon, when you don't have to.
Okay, what's circular about somebody stating that the reason why they defend threshold deontology is because they
You just reduced it down to because you prefer to. You just reduced it down to your self-verification.
Okay, so if I were to argue, I think most people at their heart are egoists, and that ethics is just one big attempt to make a bunch of egoists get along, basically. What would be invalid about that?
I'm not saying it's invalid. I'm saying it's poorly reasoned. Like, okay, I'll give you an example. Okay, if I said, I think there's God, and you go, why? And I just go, I think so. Do you think that's as worthy of consideration intellectually as someone writing an entire book explaining how exactly, based upon all findings of physics, they've concluded the universe to come about and why they have concluded it to be atheistic in nature? You wouldn't consider these two things equivalent in terms of your intellectual consideration, yeah? Or what? I don't know.
I might. If the whole book is sophistry, do you consider Darth Dawkins' defense of Christianity to be more valid than somebody just saying, "Oh, I believe in God because I just have faith"?
Yes.
You do. You consider his literal circular reason. Okay, so I believe in ethics because
because he has a point, though. And I'm not like religious or anything, but he has a legitimate point. It's just he's like now building off a bad inference. His inference is bad, but a lot of the points he does make are true. Like, yes, you're going to reach a circularity in pretty much all things you believe. Epistemologically, there's circularity. Ethically, there's circularity. Metaphysically, there's circularity. Logically, there's circularity. Like, obviously, right? And I agree. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that the only way you can know anything is God. In fact, I'd argue that there's no way you could know that based upon the information we have without reason, right? Because you'd have to reason between God or not, and whether the divine revelations you have are truly divine or not, and so you'd still have to rely on it. So the thing I'm saying is his like view is infinitely more sophisticated than someone just saying, I don't know, why not?
yeah.
Is it bullshit? Sure, but it's still certainly more sophisticated. Like I don't necessarily have to fucking throw the baby out with the bathwater here.
So you value sophisticated bullshit more than you value an admittance of a lack of ability to confirm someone's views?
Well, someone saying I believe because I believe is not to be as intellectually regarded as someone trying to give a detailed explanation as to why epistemology cannot function without there being some independent method of verification by which you can then confirm all other acts or all other areas of knowledge. Like, yeah, you can say his conclusion is incorrect, but it's certainly very well reasoned. A lot of the conclusions he does come to, it's just they're built off of bad inferences.
I mean, they're well reasoned within his framework, but his framework is just like, I don't know. It just seems like even if I don't even know if I agree it's well reasoned because it's blatantly obvious that it's circular and it seems.
Well, he admits that, but he points out a legitimate problem that there is no epistemology that isn't going to be ultimately circular. In fact, people who've tried to do work about epistemology have basically come up that there are intuitions, and it is ultimately intuitive. It's just that there are better intuitions than others. And I think it's described as intuitions from necessary experience. I think that's the term. And so this is like what a lot of analytic philosophers might say, that it's the case that while it's all intuitive, there are still better intuitions than others because some intuitions are better informed than others.
It sounds to me though like you're you're basing like what the better intuition is based on how much you reason off of that intuition, even if the initial intuition is kind of fucked.
Well, I'm saying that his system of beliefs is better reason than someone just saying, "Yeah, I think so." Like, if you were to tell me right now, I think consequentialism is true, and the whole debate was literally just you going, "I think it's true," and I'm like, "Well, why?" I just think it's true. And then we compare that to the conversation we just had. You wouldn't consider these two things like equivalent, would you? Or if I just told you I think deontology is better than consequentialism, and you went, "Why?" And I was like, "It just is." You wouldn't consider that a better conversation than the one we had now in terms of intellectual regard, would you?
No, but that'd be for a different reason. Like you'd say, so if you just say I think deontology is true, then a bit for me that'd be like, okay, well we're throwing out the meta ethics here, because to me, since I kind of like don't think that the justification for why you have the ethical framework can be necessarily given like a truth value or any of that. It seems kind of weird for me to say, okay, so there's this egoist I know who they say they value their egoism because it just seems because they don't see any reason to value anything else. I would say, okay, that's kind of a messed up reasoning, but how can I claim that that's any better or that's any worse than somebody saying, okay, I get my morality from God because I have this book that tells me I should get my morality from God? That book's going to be a lot longer than their reasoning, but I can't really, it's hard for me to formulate a reason why I would say one of them is more worthy of consideration.
I'm more so just asking as to like do you not like value sophistication when you're talking to people? Like I get what you're saying here.
So,
Because I think you do. I would assume that if I just came in here and said, I think it's the case because I think it's the case, and then just left the call after, you would not consider me in any way merited in the same way you would if I spoke the way I have thus far.
no, if you said I think it's the case because I think it's the case, then most likely what the way this conversation would have gone is I probably would have tried to reduce your system until it sounds like you're being inconsistent. And then I'd
Well,
be
you
like,
can't get inconsistent. I mean, you could, but like, if all I'm saying is I just think it's the case with self verification, then like, what would you do then?
well, I would argue that that's where most people's ethical systems come from. I mean,
Well, everything is anything we would ever claim to have knowledge on is a method of self verification, or not a method, but is found through self verification.
like I will agree with you that there are better intuitions than others. So if somebody's intuizing an ethical system to maximize suffering or something, then like their reasoning is probably going to sound fucked compared to somebody who is like reasoning an ethical system to, I don't know, have the NAP or whatever.
Yeah, but I think if you have two people with bad conclusions, I think the sophistication that goes into the bad conclusion shows a greater merit, because if they can explain something very fucking well and they can have very strong reasoning, even though they're reaching a bad conclusion, if you could explain to them why exactly their conclusion is bad and show them better conclusions, the things they could come up with for those better conclusions would be infinitely more fruitful than if they had the right conclusions.
Okay.
Like, I'll give another example. The fucking third grader who says the Holocaust happened is never going to be as interesting a speaker to me as the historian who spent his last fucking 50 years detailing every segment of World War II, the Holocaust included.
Okay, so if we're what is wrong with the conclusion with trying to argue that virtually everybody at their heart is an egoist, and the ethical system that they come up with is just basically to try to contain those desires?
I don't know if I disagree. I'd have to think about it, but I don't really think I disagree, at least as far as I'm aware.
So you agree that probably everybody at their core is an egoist?
Yeah, because I think, like I said before, I think people want their desires to be fulfilled.
Okay, so if you agree to that, why is it hard to get you on board with the idea that ethics is basically a system of preferences?
Um, because when you are telling me it's preferences, I feel like you're conflating like an emotional preference with like some greater type of desire. I'm using desire here as like a shorthand way of saying like this like this thing that in the abstract reflects a moral regard, like with a special consideration of duties and responsibilities. Like I'm just using desire here as a shorthand for something that's a little more meaningful than the difference between I like ice cream and man, I really fucking hate it when people shoot up schools.
I mean, like, I would argue that your moral system is still based on emotions, same as mine. It's just, like, for example, the way your reaction to the utility monster thing, like, can you prove that there's anything wrong with letting the utility monster rape all of humanity? Like, with that, or is it just an emotional reaction to it?
I mean, using my system of ethics, yeah, I can demonstrate to being correct.
Okay, but that's
If you're asking, if you're asking, does my system reduce down to it being a set of desires that I wish to fucking have fulfilled that are conflicted with by the utility monster? Yeah. And then if you're gonna ask, well, are those desires just a matter of you self-verifying those desires? Yeah. But then you're basically trying to hit me with, yeah, well, I mean, it's emotional because you know it's coming from your set of beliefs, and there's no way to independently verify because we don't even have access. But that would literally invalidate like all knowledge we have. You basically telling me that self verification invalidates ethics as anything more than subjective is the equivalent of me saying, well, I guess mathematics is just subjective. I guess physics is just subjective. I don't know if I'd be willing to say all that.
I mean, like,
I'm not very quick to say morality is subjective. I'm not sure if it's subjective, but I do think that it seems to be the case that we can build up a very strong system of inferences based upon the basal value of respecting and exercising desires.
sure, but I could say the same thing about how it would about building a system of values based on maximizing well-being, and then ultimately my justification with that would reduce to basically the same thing as yours, in that it's basically an emotional desire.
Well, your problem with well-being is that you admitted that it's like not super rigorous a term, and that what you more specifically just mean is happiness, which is why we talked about happiness. And so when we talked about happiness, you admitted there are cases in which you wouldn't force someone to stay alive because them committing suicide is reasonable given the state of affairs and their experienced state of affairs for fucking decades. So there are cases in which you're willing to violate the rule, and a rule utilitarian upholds these rules even in bad instances because these rules tend to produce more good. So either it's the case that you're going to uphold this rule and force this person to suffer decades more because, well, I got to uphold consequentialism because rule utilitarianism, though. Or it's the case that you default to a better system of ethics, which I think mine would be, or whatever system you'd conjure up in this case, to reconcile the fact that if you're forcing this man to stay alive, even though, or if you allow this man to kill himself specifically, then you are disallowing any sort of happiness, but in disallowing that happiness, you've now made it to where this guy doesn't have to fucking suffer anymore. Now, if you make it the case that, well, it's just a minimization of suffering, then we can get back into why this justifies the genocide of humanity. And even if you were to tell me, I think humans still have a right to defend themselves, that wouldn't necessarily entail, by any means, the monster being evil. So I'm just saying, like, there are a series of problems that come into what you've described, and all I'm saying is, like, at best, you're willing to basically force people who suffer to suffer because I just really like my ethical system, rather than consider a more applicable ethical system, which seems to be more universal in application and just default.
Okay, so in the situations where like for suicide, where it would seem like my ethical system is being invalidated, the reason why is because I have to structure my ethical system under the assumption that most people do not know the full ramifications of their actions. However, if those ramifications were completely known, then then I would make my decision based on the maximizing of happiness and the minimizing of suffering at a ratio. For example, the suicide thing. Because the person could be irrational, I would not allow them to commit suicide unless it was a clear case where, okay, them committing suicide would be normalizing the ratio, basically, because they're never going to have a positive ratio, so them committing suicide would bring them back to 0, 0. So like it doesn't really seem like there's a conflict there. The reason why I wouldn't allow it in
Well, they're not maximizing well-being or specifically happiness by killing themselves, right? But if you're going to tell me that's cool because they're minimizing suffering, then it just carries the host of problems I just mentioned.
But
it's going to reduce down to the utility monster. And even if you tell me, well, it's okay for us to defend ourselves against the utility monster, then the problem still is, are you going to morally validate this utility monster or not? That was the question. And if you tell me, well, no, I don't validate the moral utility monster, then what you're telling me is it's neither a maximization of or specifically happiness. It's neither a maximization of happiness, neither is it a minimization of suffering. And so you'd have to default to something else. And I'm saying that if you have to default to something else, I think it's just easier to default to the system I've built up.
it sounds like you're arguing that arguing that two axioms as a ratio is itself a problem.
In this case, yeah.
So you don't see how it could be consistent to try to maximize the ratio rather than either one of those axioms?
No, I'm not arguing for a lot of this, I'm not going to argue about consistency. I'm not, unless I specifically am posing a question of your consistency. More so, I just don't see how exactly you would both maximize well-being or specifically happiness, then fail to do so in the case of this suicide guy, and then also let him die because it would minimize suffering, knowing that if we were to kill all people right now, it would minimize all the suffering of war. It would minimize all the suffering of famine. It would minimize the suffering of hardcore imperialism. It would minimize the suffering of mental illness. It would minimize the suffering of every possible error we will ever have. But you wouldn't justify the murder of all of humanity. So if it's neither the case that, again, you can do it through maximizing happiness, and also not the case that you can do it through minimizing suffering, it has to be something else.
No, I think the problem is when I'm arguing it's a ratio, you then look at each axiom individually. When I'm trying to argue that increasing the ratio is what I'm trying to go for. For example, I can't justify the extermination of all human life unless that would somehow increase the ratio.
Well, if suicide isn't increasing the ratio, then what are you relying?
No, all right. So my argument for preventing someone from committing suicide is that I would argue in most cases they're making the decision irrationally and they're not actually increasing the ratio. The time that I change my mind is when it's quite clear that they are actually increasing the ratio.
Well, I mean, in the individual case of the suicide guy we described him being in a perennial malaise, what do you do with him? Do you force him to stay alive because you have to uphold your rule utilitarianism, or do you default to a better system of ethics?
So in the case of that guy, it sounds like that guy is always in a negative ratio. So assuming that like I know that he's in a negative ratio, then yes, in that case
Yeah.
it would be moral for me to allow him to kill himself. But that's
But this doesn't improve. This doesn't improve the ratio. So
what you mean? You were assuming that his suffering is exceeding his well-being.
yeah, and his suffering exceeding the well-being, even if you end it, doesn't improve the ratio, does it?
Well, it brings it from negative to 0, 0.
Well, how? Okay, this is gonna sound weird, but how do you know that his suffering is a negative? How do you know it isn't just a zero?
You don't. I thought we were going under the assumption that I did know that his suffering and his well-being.
Because it doesn't specifically improve happiness. He doesn't get more happy because he's like dead now. He like physically is incapable of happiness.
No, but all right. So if we're assuming that he's at a negative ratio, then that would remove all emotions. That would remove his happiness and his suffering, which would set him to 0, 0.
And still doesn't improve his happiness though.
Well,
Which is what you said you were looking toward. You said you were looking towards improving happiness.
well, his happiness in this case doesn't make up for his suffering.
Okay, so is it then a minimization of suffering? Because that still carries the boat of problems I was mentioning.
No, it's a ratio.
Okay, but then how are we deciding whether this ratio is bad? Like, what are we doing here? Are we looking to improve his happiness? Because regardless of whether we let him kill himself or not, his happiness isn't getting better. Now, if it's the case that we let him kill himself to end his suffering, it's about minimization of suffering.
Okay, let's look at this like a math equation. All right, so let's say his suffering is 50, or it's 50. So we're looking at this as a ratio. So if we're looking at happiness to suffering, we can also look at this as one number. So it would be the ratio would be at negative 50. So let's say he had 10 happiness, that would still bring it up to negative 40. So if he were to kill himself because he's suffering at an extent where the ratio is at negative 40, this would bring his happiness and his suffering down both to 0, leveling at a 0 ratio.
So is happiness positive? Right? It's positive, correct?
Yes, happiness would be like adding
Is
to the
0 a
equation.
positive number?
Um,
Because I don't think it is.
I don't see what you're saying. Are you saying that like at 0 he should be I should be allowing him to commit suicide, or I shouldn't be allowing him to commit suicide? What are you saying?
My problem is it's actually kind of interesting that you use the math setup, because even if we were to do it this way, what you are effectively telling me is what we're trying to do here is make it to where his numeric is positive. And so I'm asking, does reducing all of the negative numbers make his numeric positive? Because you said it only ends up at 0. And so I'm asking, is 0 a positive number?
No, my goal is to increase the ratio. Ideally, the ratio would be positive.
Okay, so then it's not a matter of maximizing happiness, or in this case, maximizing the positive numeric.
Wait, what do you mean? It's increasing the ratio.
Not, it is, but increasing it through the frame of what?
What do you mean through the frame of what? His suffering is outweighing his happiness by a great amount. So if he commits suicide, it goes to 0. Is 0 a higher number than -40?
It's a higher number, but he's not in any way happy. So it's not about maximizing happiness in your case.
No, I don't see why we're having an issue here, because it's
Because
increasing
0
the
isn't a
ratio.
positive number.
Yeah, that
But
doesn't matter.
no, because you specific. Well, you said the way we improve the ratio is through maximizing happiness. There's no happiness being maximized here.
It's maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering as a ratio.
It actually reduces happiness because his happiness is now at 0.
Yes, but his suffering is now at 0 too.
But how is it improving the ratio if you said the way we improve the ratio is through the frame of happiness? And I said, okay, if it's through the frame of happiness, and this is what you agreed to, then it's to maximize happiness. And you were like, yeah, because you originally were talking about maximization of well-being. And so if it's to maximize happiness, it's not maximizing happiness by defaulting it to 0.
No, in this case, it's reducing his suffering. The fact that it's also reducing.
Wait, that's my thing. If it is reducing his suffering, then it's about minimization of suffering. And if it's a minimization of suffering,
No, what you're doing is you're trying to like get me on one axiom when I'm arguing two axioms as a ratio, and like
well,
I
what
think
axiom are you using to decide one axiom over the other? Because you have to have a third axiom now, unless you're like a moral particularist.
No, I guess in most cases I would argue for like that there is a higher value on reducing suffering compared to increasing happiness, but like overall my value is improving the ratio. And like when I say there's a higher value on suffering, that's like we can't really put hard numbers on these things, so I'm not even sure that even like adds anything.
Yeah, we're just using a general numeric representation. My problem here isn't that. It's literally just if you're setting it up and you're acknowledging that 0 is just being devoid of both happiness and suffering, and you have to look at it through a maximization of happiness, and you can't maximize happiness from 0 downward because it can only be a positive number.
I don't.
Then you have to look at it through the lens of reducing suffering. But both of these two things carry a bunch of problems. So even if you want to go with either of these two things, you're still carrying a bunch of problems that haven't been reconciled. And even if you wanted to, we could just look at either one individually and then look at how they stand when examined all together, because they're not going to reconcile the problems that have been posed originally.
Like I still don't see like why when I'm talking about ratio, we keep going to looking at these things individually. They can't.
Well, because you said you wanted to maximize happiness, and now you're talking about the reduction of suffering.
Yes, because I want to do them both because they're both part of the same ratio.
Yeah, but that's using two different methods and two specifically contradictory methods. And if you're going to do that, then we can look at it through the moral representation. The alien case. If you're telling me it's the case that, well, I don't want to get killed by aliens, so minimize suffering. Oh, fuck. Actually, if we minimize suffering, then we got to kill people. Oh, wait, maximize well-being. Well, actually, you gotta maximize well-being. Well, I guess the super sensitive alien cock is gonna like cock us all to death. Like these are the two conclusions you're gonna come to, and you can try and reconcile either one with each other, but it's not gonna work. I guess like I said, you could argue for moral particularism if you'd like, but you can run into quite a few issues with that.
Like, I think the issue here is you're claiming that there's issues, but I'm not seeing those issues.
I don't know. All I'm saying is like there are problems that you can bring up with either, and if you use that, like if you use both of them to reconcile each other, there has to be something you can use to basically bundle them together, right? Like think of like two sticks, right? If I lay two sticks on a desk, they're not really connected. Um, but if you use them to connect, or if you use like a rubber band to connect them, now they're connected, and you can consider them like a proper pair.
So you're trying to argue that happiness and suffering aren't really connected to one another, correct?
I'm saying more so. I don't see what your connective is.
I don't see why they have to be connected. I mean, if I had an moral system that says that my moral system is it is ethical to maximize the amount of blue in the world, and it is unethical to, I don't know, maximize red.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I don't see like if I wanted to paint the world blue or something. I mean, like, even if we made them completely unconnected, like say, okay, maximizing the amount of blue in the world versus human suffering or something like that. Then we could just weigh, okay, so how much blue are we creating without, versus how much suffering we are creating.
I mean, think of them as goals, right? Like, let's just say my moral position is that blue is goodness. If I think it is the case that more blue equals better, then all people who paint themselves blue are good people, and that's it. That's the fact of the matter. And all people who don't paint themselves blue should be like stabbed to death, I guess. And if it is the case that it's to minimize, all colors not blue, anyone who tries to paint anything not blue should be like killed, I guess. Like you have like weird fucking like conclusions that will come with these. And what I'm just trying to say is these two things are very different goals and will come with like specifically different conclusions. And so I'm just trying to understand is if you give me both of these, you're basically giving me two different goals. And if you use them to reconcile each other, I don't know what connective you're using to bundle them together, like a pair of sticks. Because if there's not a connective and you're a moral particularist or something, then, like I said, I can argue against a moral particularism. But
okay, let's just go with moral particularism. Let's just say that I am a moral particularism or a moral particularist. What's the problem here?
You have no grounding for any ethical claim, like at all.
I still don't see what the problem is because I could argue that.
Well, you would literally justify me like holocausting your entire family. Like if I were to literally like put a gun to your mom's head, you'd have to be like, well, there's not a principle against this, but I'm not cool with it. Like,
no, I could argue it's against my moral system.
Well, even if you did that, I'd just say it's cool in my moral system, and then like massacre your family.
Yeah, but then I could fight you in accordance to my moral system.
If we had you tied up and made you watch, it wouldn't be like cool, would it?
No, I'm saying, what I'm saying is in accordance to my moral system, what you would be doing would still be evil. So basically you're just saying, I mean, if you want to argue morality as might makes right, then we could...
No, I'm saying, like, even if you were to say, well, like, I think it's bad, I could be like, well, in this specific instance, it's not bad. And you're like, why? I'd be like, I don't know, but it's not bad, bro. Like, that wouldn't be a compelling argument, would it? That's what I'm specifically getting at.
Because moral particularism is just saying that there are no principles by which you abide by, and that all situations are basically are basically adherent to no real standard. And if that's the case, and there's no real standard, then I can just do effectively whatever. In some cases, I could make a very elaborate justification as to why it's not cool for you to steal my $5 bill off the lunch table. But then I could also give the standard of, well, this is just cool when I like, I don't know, I like kill orphans.
I mean, like, even if I had really good grounding in my ethical system, there's nothing I can do to prevent you from coming up with a bad ethical system, so I don't see what the point.
Well, I'm saying hypothetically, would you consider it compelling if I went, I'm going to kill orphans, and you went, why? And then in another case, I was just like, yeah, bro, I actually refuse to let you steal my $5, and you're like, why? And I give you a very strong description of liberty and like the things most political philosophers have described, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Hobbes unlocked when concerning property rights. And then also like going back to Aristotelian thought and political philosophy, and trying to delve into like Machiavellian ideas, you wouldn't fucking be like, damn, dude. I guess it is pretty compelling that you're gonna kill those orphans because you want to, right? Because that's like I mean, moral particularism is in and of itself kind of absurd already, but I mean, it's like a very quick problem that comes up. You don't have any real standard by which you're adherent to. So if that's the case, you could justify anything, you yourself included.
It seems like I could still be consistent within my own ethical system. It's just
Well, consistency isn't like, I don't know. Well, I do think consistency is part of the puzzle. I don't think consistency is the only thing that really makes up what makes a strong system of belief.
so.
That's why I said earlier I was interested in sophistication of belief. Oh,
Well, like I don't place any value on a sophisticated bullshitter though. I think we're approaching this from like hugely different bases of how we view things.
well, you care about the truthhood of a statement, yes?
Yeah, I care if that statement is true.
So then obviously there's more than just consistency in the puzzle of what makes a strong system of belief.
Yeah, but I don't think ethical statements can be true or false. That's where we run into an issue.
Okay, so if someone said raping fucking children is bad, you'd be like, I don't know.
No, I'd agree with it within my moral system.
Well, then that's expressing a truthhood. It's just a subjective truthhood, but there still would be a truthhood.
Okay, so I guess I value that there are subjective truths um, when applied to a presupposition, but
Mhm.
I don't think like there is like a grand way that you can prove, okay, rape is wrong or anything like that.
Um, well, I guess I don't think it's as easy as making a natural explanation. Like, I don't think it's the same way you'd like. In, I think it's the same way you'd investigate whether mosquitoes lay eggs, right? Is a hard data-backed science or what have you. But I think it's abstract, like I said earlier. Like I think it's like looking oftentimes at a series of inferences, and oftentimes whether these inferences are strong. I think it's very comparable to mathematics. I consider it a series of abstractions.
All right, yeah, I think there's a very fundamental issue here. Um, yeah, like I don't see how. All right, so I said that I value the truth value of statements. Like, how does that is there any like issue with me saying that, and then me also saying that I think that moral statements can't have truth values? It doesn't seem like.
Oh, no, no, no. What I was specifically saying there was a problem with was you saying that you're consistent in your views. And I was saying, like, whether you're consistent or not isn't, like, the only relevant determinant of whether your system of belief is meaningful. I was saying that there are more facets of what makes a system of belief meaningful. And I think part of that can be truth value. I think part of that can be how reasoned it is. And at least here, intersubjectively, part of it is like truthhood.
I mean, like, it seems like if we separate any of these things, like, let's say somebody gives a very well reasoned response to, like, they have like a 50 paper essay explaining why they think the Holocaust is fake. Like, would you like view that as being better than someone just simply saying, no, the Holocaust was real?
I consider that better in the domain of being well reasoned, yeah. Like, I have more respect for the fucking flat earth obsessors than the person who simply goes, I don't know, I think so.
I mean, like, I guess, like, from a level of effort, I agree with you. It's just like I don't view effort in itself as being necessarily something I value. If somebody were to spend a lot of time and effort killing thousands of people, I wouldn't view that as being like very worthwhile, in my opinion.
Well, it's not even a matter of effort. It's just about like reasoning. Like I do value the sophistication of things because I think these sophistications tend to be reflective of a greater set of reasoning, even if these reasons lead to bad conclusions. Like, I think you as a consequentialist come to crazy fucking conclusions. Like, the utility monster shit, holy fuck, dude. I've heard so many consequentialists, like, try and defend why exactly it's okay for, like, humanity to get fucking raped, and you basically told me right at the beginning that you defended similarly to how humans would have to defend, like, killing a bunch of ants, an alien destroying us, because basically why the fuck not? And it's like, whoa, like, this is some like crazy shit, dude.
Wait,
But
wait. So, if you had to save one human or 100 ants, would you save the ants?
no.
So, how are you valuing that?
Because I would probably save neither, to be honest.
Okay, well, I consider that a pretty wacky response.
No, I'm just fucking with you, dude. No, I'd save the humans specifically because I think they meet a greater level of autonomy.
And you wouldn't say, like, the alien that's raping all of humanity, they meet a greater level of autonomy?
They do, but it's not like I'm over here fucking... It's not like I'm over here defending the alien, like, literally killing humanity, right?
No, but, like,
Like, if you were to say, would you choose between, like, an alien or, like, a bunch of, or, like, one, like, super strong alien or a bunch of other aliens? I was like, well, how are you going to do this? It would depend. Like, if you're telling me the way I'd have to choose between you and the ants is, like, killing the ants, I'd probably just do nothing, right? Like, assuming the ants are fucking sentient. But, if it was like, yeah, you guys are both gonna die in, like, 100 years or some shit like that, you can give one of us the medication. I'm gonna give it to the person.
I mean, like, I would say, like, the inaction through which you would allow both the human and 100 ants to die when you could have prevented one of those things, that seems like a pretty fucked up situation, even like compared to like me saying, okay, one alien who has infinite ability to maximize their own well-being is just going to completely fuck over all of humanity. It seems like if we're looking at this as a ratio, it seems like you're basically allowing for a much greater evil.
Not really.
I mean, in terms of a ratio.
I don't think the difference between us and ants is the same as the difference between us and like something literally omnipotent.
Okay, so you'd be fine with something literally omnipotent deciding to destroy all of humanity?
No.
Alright, what if this was a factor
Well,
of its
I would
autonomy?
in certain cases, but like only if the people were cool with it.
So, like, what if it needed to destroy humanity to live?
No.
So you would say it should martyr itself?
Not martyr itself. I'm saying like you can't force other people to give up their livelihoods.
I mean, like, it seems like the issues that you'll bite the bullet on are inaction. Like, you'd argue you don't, but like it seems kind of inconsistent on that. Like, you would argue that it's okay for
Well, it depends. Like, yeah, it depends though. Like, it depends on specifically what you mean by like I have to choose between the ants and the human. Also, this assumes that ants are sentient, and that I believe ants are sentient. Like I said, assuming ants are sentient and like people are sentient, like I don't know, it'd be a very like weird decision to make. But for the sake of not fucking making this weird thing where I can suddenly choose some lives over others, and I can just start fucking hurting people because damn dude, this benefits certain people over others, which could literally like lead into yeah, slave owners are better than fucking like niggers and like weird fucking arguments like that. Um, then I'd like fucking like I'd either choose an action, or if like I was forced to choose like and I'd like choose to get killed, I guess, because I'd rather not do something that is aversive to the autonomy of creatures. Just not cool with it.
So, like, I don't understand, though, because it seems like if I scale this up to a high enough degree, you'll change your mind. Like, with the example that if you have one guy, if everybody in the world is sick, one guy has the vaccine, but he's not giving it to anybody, I think you probably bite the bullet and attacking that guy, but the situation's pretty similar.
No, the situations are like largely incongruous. The reason I'd be willing to attack that guy is because he's directly, not directly, but he is very strongly and pretty much directly jeopardizing all of humanity.
Well, let's say that he designed the vaccine, but he decided not to give it out to people. How is he any different than a observer who does absolutely nothing?
Because in the case of him having the ability to actually do something and withholding it, he's risking the lives of a bunch of people, whereas an inactive observer is not necessarily someone who is going ahead and is not someone who goes ahead and necessarily has the access to stopping it.
Wait.
Now, if you're going to stay in the individual case, well, you have the action to stop it. You're not choosing between humanity and a smaller scale population. You're just choosing between humanity or not. You're choosing between autonomy or not. Like that's the decision you're making.
Wait, this still contradicts your 100 ants in the human example, though, because
it doesn't.
Well, in that case, you're not making a decision that would save one of them. Right, so in the guy with the vaccine versus all of humanity, you're fucking over the guy with the vaccine to save all of humanity. However, in the 100 ants and the human, you're kind of fucking both of them over by not doing anything.
No, because one's directly, you're pretty much directly jeopardizing the other. The ants aren't like fucking gonna kill the human, or the ants aren't withholding some medication that could save all of humanity.
Well, no, we're basically saying that. Well, like, okay, you know what? Let's change the vaccine example. The guy's vaccine is in his blood. He can't replicate it.
Oh, I don't know. If he's not willing to, I don't think he's obligated.
So you would say that that guy who the vaccine is in his blood, he has to die in order to save all of humanity. You'd say that you would not be okay with killing him to save all of humanity.
No.
Ah, okay. This seems like a pretty bad bite the bullet situation for you.
Not at all. Because if you want to look at the inverse, if I said yes, then you could literally argue in favor of slavery. If you want to try and argue for slavery, that's cool. But...
No, because you also respect people's autonomy. And if you were going to go from a utilitarian framework, you could argue that killing that guy respects as many people's autonomy as possible.
Yeah, but if you're going to do that, then you could say the beneficiaries of white slave owners hundreds of years ago greatly outweighed the numerical value of not only the slaves, but the slaves fucking suffering, because the economies that were benefited from the transatlantic slave trade did very well. So then you could make it the case that, well, I guess just white slave owners get to be cool, bro. White slave owners get to slave away these black people. Like, I don't know. I'm not willing to bite that kind of bullet. But if you want to try and defend slavery, I mean, that's up to you.
I'm not sure, like, that even, like... I'm not even sure that's
Well,
true.
you're respecting the autonomy of more people.
I don't think having
I
don't think having a better economy is maximizing autonomy more than having free people in a worse economy.
According to certainly not the vast amount of white people.
I mean, we're arguing that a huge amount of people benefit slightly.
Because the weird utilitarian idea you have of autonomy is very loose, and it's what I was saying at the very beginning. Consequentialism can be used to demonstrate really any conclusion.
Yeah, but
and in this case, it could literally be used to demonstrate why slavery was cool. Like, what you're asking me is like something that'll probably never happen. And even in the case that that if it were to happen, I wouldn't be okay with it, because I think human life is not only just that valuable, but so valuable, in fact, that to jeopardize one is to jeopardize the integrity of all fucking life. Whereas in the case of you think people are some like weird like numeric that we can use for pretty much any real conclusion. And if that's the case, then you got to defend slavery, unless you don't think that the vast amount of slave owners, well, maybe not vast amount of slave owners, but the vast amount of beneficiaries from slave owning outweigh the shortened autonomies of the few black people that were in the nation, because there were actually not that many black people.
Yeah, but I would argue the amount of suffering or the amount of autonomy lost in slavery outweighs the autonomy gained through having a better economy. Like, you'd have to, like...
According to who? Again, not the white people.
Oh, well, like, if we're going to go by, like, well, I say that I'm gaining blah, 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 then you could justify anything through that line of logic, too.
That's what I think utilitarianism does.
I mean, like, I could argue that I'm saying that killing someone is one of the worst things you could do is basically just a preference, so...
Yeah, and if you just want to say it's just a preference, you could say getting raped in the ass at work by your boss is the same as someone buying a chocolate ice cream over vanilla.
I mean, somebody could argue with that, but I'd still disagree with them.
You could argue that, but if like I rape you, you can't go and complain about it.
Sure, I can because it contradicts my moral system.
No, you can't have any real complaint about it because it's supposed to be the same. It's pretty much the same exact thing as me giving you vanilla ice cream over chocolate, right? Because it's just a preference. If it's that meaningless, yeah, I guess you know, vanilla
I
over
mean,
getting raped
I mean
or
like
getting
that.
raped over vanilla.
I mean, like, I'm trying to think of an analogy. All right, so that would be like stating that there is an objective type of beauty. So, like, there are.
What's wrong with saying there's an objective beauty?
The fact that a lot of people have different preferences.
Well, that's begging the question.
What do you mean that's begging the question?
You're telling me that beauty isn't objective. So you're saying it's subjective, correct?
Yes, and I'm using as an evidence for it that there are uh, di- different preferences in terms of beauty.
But you're but then but then your evidence is literally just that you think that their preferences and that beauty is something that is a matter of preference. If
Oh,
you think beauty is a matter of preference and you're using this to demonstrate that beauty is subjective, you're just effectively just saying beauty is subjective because beauty is subjective.
so wait, me stating that there's different people with their own subjective views on beauty cannot be used as evidence to argue that beauty is subjective. Because,
Listen to the way you just said it now. You're saying
yeah,
people having subjective
oh,
views about
okay,
beauty being subjective is demonstrative of it being subjective.
okay, wait, let's reverse this. Okay, so there being some objective evidence of something cannot prove that that thing is objective.
Wait, what?
No, I just reversed it. So by your line of reasoning that saying that there is objective
What is a subjective evidence?
no, let's say there is
No,
objective.
no, I get your analogy. I know what you're drawing here, but I'm saying like then what would the equivalent here be of a subjective evidence? There's evidence of the subjective. Is that what you mean?
Well, no, I'm arguing that there is there's subjective opinions. There's preferences that people have, which demonstrates that there is subjectivity in beauty.
Well, what you have to demonstrate is that if I say, for example, my girlfriend is beautiful, you have to demonstrate to me that this is independent of truth value. You have to show to me that this is a matter of opinion.
Wait, isn't that reversed? Isn't the burden of proof on you because you're saying that she's beautiful and this is objectively true?
I'm not saying this is objectively true. I'm not sure, but I wouldn't necessarily default to saying that this is subjective. I don't know if it is subjective. I'm not sure. I'm undecided.
Well, if you're saying that she is beautiful, but you're not sure, and
I'm not sure whether this is an objective thing or not.
it kind of sounds like you're just trying not to take a position.
Yeah, I'm undecided on a lot of philosophical things because I don't know if I either lack the available knowledge to guarantee a position, or if there's really any guaranteed position to have with all of our available resources at a given moment.
Well, if there's no guaranteed position, wouldn't that imply that that beauty is subjective?
No, that's not the necessary inference. Like, we don't know for certain whether the universe even is a simulation or not. But this wouldn't be an inference to, or there wouldn't be an inference to make that the universe is subjective. Like, right? Like, do you get what I'm saying? Just because you can have an undecided position on it doesn't mean that it is subjective now.
No, no,
Like, if you went, do you know if God exists? You wouldn't tell the agnostic, yeah, it's subjective, bro. You're just saying it's subjective. Like, the agnostic isn't saying they're subjective. The agnostic is just saying, I'm not sure.
no, no. What I'm saying is that, let's say that we can know for a fact there is no objective beauty. So we know that for a fact. Doesn't it follow that since beauty does seem to exist in a way, it has to exist in a subjective form?
No.
So if it's not subjective or objective, what is it?
No, wait, are you saying, wait, are you presupposing that it's a non-objective?
Well, I'm presupposing that for this hypothetical, we know that beauty is not objective.
If we knew that, then obviously it would be the case that's probably subjective. There might be something beyond subjectivity and objectivity, I'm not sure. But yeah, it would probably be the case that's subjective. But the dispute we had was whether ethics could be distinguished between beauty, or distinguished through beauty in any meaningful way. And so I was like, what do you mean? And you're basically like, beauty, much in the same way as ethics, is just a matter of valuation, and this valuation is subjective. And I said, I'm not so sure about that. And so you asked me to demonstrate that it's objective. I was never saying that it was necessarily objective, but I feel your grounding for why it's subjective isn't very strong. Simply telling me that it's disagreed upon by a lot of people is like telling me that religion is just a matter of opinion, which is to say that there's no fact of the matter. Whether there's a God or not just depends on what you think, bro. Like, I don't know, not a very strong position. Right?
I mean, like, we could like determine that it's subjective based on, like, I don't know, looking at various stimuli for different types of people or whatever, because that would indicate that there isn't a singular objective model. But like, I don't know, that gets into weird.
Wait, so whether, I mean, I guess you could try and get into like idealism or something, but like even then, I don't know how effective that would be.
I mean, like,
but it's like saying if Shelley believes that the Christian God is true, does that mean like Shelley is correct and Sheldon is also correct if he believes Allah is true? Like, because if you say yes, you're basically saying you don't believe in science, mind you, because you're denying like basically all of anything metaphysical and specifically ontological.
No, there's a difference. I'm just trying to think about how to word it. So, when somebody says that God is true, they're making a claim without evidence, basically. When somebody says that a beauty is subjective, they are still making a claim without evidence, but they're making a much softer claim than the idea that beauty is objective. They're basically stating, well, I don't think that there is an objective answer. Now, if somebody were to say, I don't think there is a God, that has the same sort of claim without evidence as stating, I don't think that that there are non-black ravens, basically. We're just assuming albino ravens don't exist. But it's basically like, what's the term? Like the raven paradox, basically. Like if you had an apple, that would be proof of a non-black, non-raven, but you can't actually prove all ravens are black because you can't possibly find all ravens, or something like that. So the idea is that when you have multiple examples of subjective evidence, it's not actually proof that undeniably that the subjective conclusion is true, but the claim that there is an objective truth can be disproved through one subjective. I don't know if I'm explaining this correctly, but like one counterexample would disprove an objective statement.
Yeah, and my thing is, even if we're going off of the idea that one subjective example could potentially disprove something objective, it would have to be something that could necessarily be demonstrated to be a matter of subjectivity or specifically a matter of opinion.
Well,
Like, when you say, ow, this is a matter of opinion, this has literally no truth value. Like, ow cannot be expressed propositionally. When you say God exists, that can be expressed propositionally. We can determine that to be true. Well, maybe we can't determine that to be true, but there is a matter of fact as to whether God exists or not, as far as we can make sure of with like knowledge and what have you. Or whether I'm talking to you right now. That's a matter of fact. There's no like opinion of whether I'm talking to you or not. Even if I can't prove it completely, there's still a matter of fact to it, no?
sure, but that just gets into the idea that even under solipsism, everything in reality is still objective.
Wait, what?
So, if we're arguing that, then under solipsism, everything in reality is still objective. We just can't prove it to be objective. That means that subjectivity doesn't actually exist.
I'm not even so sure about that. My thing is just, if you're going to say, well, ethics is like beauty, and I'm like, how? And you're like, it's subjective. I'm going to be like, well, how do you know that? And you can't just tell me people disagree. Because people disagree about a lot of things. But there's still one thing that is going to be ultimately true. This happens in physics. This happens in biology. This happens in mathematics. This happens in really any field of study that people would take seriously. This also happens in theology. So all walks of life and all studies that we've ever done have encountered disagreements. Disagreements isn't necessarily indicative of subjectivity.
So I would argue that the fact that there is disagreements and there doesn't seem to be any objective evidence to lend itself to the idea that there is an objective truth to beauty is similar to the fact that there doesn't seem to be any objective truth that lends itself to the fact that there is an objective morality. And in that way, I could argue that they're both probably subjective.
So you're just saying it seems to be the case based upon all available evidence.
Yes, all available evidence has not proven to the idea that there is an objective beauty.
Well, what exactly? Well, what evidence would you even look for? I guess.
Well, that's the thing, because, like, what evidence would you look for to there being an objective morality? You can state that there is an objective morality, but, like, you wouldn't be able to prove, like, you can't show me this is a good.
I don't think lack of proof can determine a conclusion that's for one position or another. I think a lack of proof would typically lead you to be agnostic.
Well,
I don't know.
Hold on. Let's say you have the lack of proof that Bigfoot exists. So there's no proof that Bigfoot exists. Now, what's a more unreasonable claim to say? I believe Bigfoot exists despite the lack of proof, or I believe Bigfoot probably doesn't exist because there is no proof that he exists.
Well, it would depend on a variety of circumstances. So, for example, if someone has studied, we know this, say that people know this, that for decades, no, not even decades, centuries, people have tried to locate Bigfoot and have done every fucking thing possible to find Bigfoot, and there's nothing. And then the crazy person is a person who believes that the finest minds have been unable to find anything, or just all like conspiring. But if a person, for whatever reason, just spawns on an island and they start inquiring as to the shape of the Earth and they can see no curvature, and they assume the Earth, they have to assume either the Earth is flat or it's not flat, or stay undecided, and they just go, I have no idea. I'm going to be like, yeah, I mean, fair enough. But if they have to decide between one of the two conclusions, seeing no curvature, I think that you could make a case that the person on the fucking flat island would be like, oh, I guess the Earth is flat. And they could reason a very bad conclusion given the available evidence, right?
Yeah, but you're just arguing that somebody could be ignorant, rational, and come to the wrong conclusion. That doesn't really disprove anything I've said.
Well, actually, what I'm saying is when you're telling me something is reasonable or not, it's very context dependent when we're looking at these assumptions.
Sure, but I'm not really arguing. I'm arguing like what's more reasonable.
Well, obviously, someone saying, and I think anyone who knows like the general, I'm into cryptozoology, by the way, so it's generally it's generally as fucking like crazy as saying something like, yeah, dinosaurs didn't exist, for like people who are into cryptozoology. People have looked into Bigfoot as often as possible, and there's no evidence of the hominid that's been described by different folks. There's been a Bigfoot. Like, that's not a real thing in cryptozoology. But in philosophy, there are plenty of people who argue for an objective morality. So there are certainly like legitimate experts of ethical philosophy. There are legitimate ethicists who argue for an objective morality.
Yeah, but
moreover, there's also the case that and it's very similar to theological arguments made, but in this case, it's a little more grounded. I mean, something we do have in mind is literally that we've been exploring it for so long that while we may not necessarily have the means to investigate it properly, there has to be something there for us to examine, because we don't constantly examine why we like the taste of strawberry ice cream. We are constantly examining why exactly, for example, calling someone the N-word is fucking bad. We are constantly examining why exactly lying is bad, or why stealing is bad. We've done it for pretty much all of modern thought, if not longer. We've ethicized for a very long time. We've moralized for a very long time. We've not done that with something as simple as liking vanilla ice cream. So that itself is evidence, the fact that we've tried to study it for so long, and that people constantly try and grapple with moral ideas. These are pieces of evidence. Also, if you treat it like mathematics, which I'm more of a non-naturalist, then if you see it as just a set of abstractions which are just built off of inferences, again, like mathematics, it's not really this like crazy thing, like at all.
So I don't see how there being a lot of people who argue for an objective morality who have not demonstrated that there is an objective morality is not evidence against that viewpoint.
Wait, say that again?
So you argue that there's been a lot of philosophers who argue for an objective morality, but they've been unable to prove an objective morality. So isn't that...
Well, how do you know they've been unable to prove it?
Because you can't like show me a good or show me an evil.
Wait, okay. What do you mean I can't show you a good or an evil?
You can't like prove that something is good or something is evil, like objectively.
Do you think that we have like a spiritual side, or do you think that we're just a physical body?
I am very much a materialist.
Okay, so in the case of philosophy of mind, you realize that people like epiphenomenalists, among other among other types of like dualists and what have you, literally believe and give complete explanations that are not necessarily the most demonstrative, but are much more demonstrative and much better reasoned than things like being materialistic in terms of views on philosophy of mind. The major reason that people subscribe to the idea that it's all just a material world, and specifically that we're material creatures, and that the mind is merely an experience that comes from a physical and corporeal body, is literally just because neuroscience has been right in the past, right? So just because we have a lack of evidence for things doesn't necessarily mean, even in your case, that you're going to disregard that field of study.
Well, no, I'm not disregarding it. I'm saying that there's a lack of evidence, which seems to lend to the idea that maybe
You
more.
can make the same thing for you could say the same exact thing for saying that there's no soul when you're talking about the mind.
I do make that same argument.
No, you couldn't, because you're actually on the side that doesn't have very strong evidence at the moment, because we're still early into the development of neurobiology.
Wait. Hold on. So, stating that there is a soul without any evidence, that seems more valid to you.
No, but I'm saying also that the arguments you're making against ethics isn't valid, or ethics being objective isn't valid. My problem with what you're saying is that you use one standard for philosophy of mind and another for ethical philosophy, and I'm specifically pointing out that your problem lies in saying, well, I think that it's just the case that the mind is a material experience. But in you saying that, you're literally on the side that has less evidence, that has less reason, that has less study. Despite the fact that it seems to have stronger predictions. It has stronger predictions, and I agree. I'm probably not. I might be an epiphenomenalist, probably not. But like, one thing I could literally ask you is, okay, can you show me what specific arrangement of atoms leads to the development of conscience or consciousness? Can you show me any of this? Can you show me what arrangement of atoms leads to sentience or any of these things? And you could not do it.
Yeah, but why is that a problem?
Because that literally means you're on the side with less evidence.
Okay, so by this logic, the Aztecs actually, when they were performing sacrifices to their gods to create like better weather and shit, they were actually on a side with more evidence than their neighbors who did not perform sacrifices.
Yeah, exactly. That's my point, though. That's a silly thing to believe. And if you admit that's a silly thing to believe, you can't use that as an objection upon fucking objective morality, because you admit it's not a very strong objection in other cases.
No, but it follows the same sort of reasoning. They had evidence.
It doesn't.
All right. So I'm trying to think about how to put this. Okay, so during the Black Plague, the doctors at the time had reasoned that bathing was somehow spreading the plague. They had all sorts of papers and stuff at the time arguing for that viewpoint. By the way you were holding value in terms of thought, that should have had more value than the current prevailing idea that bathing was fine and that it's unconnected.
I think you're missing my point here. My point is that you were bringing up an objection to the thought of objective morality. And so originally mine was, hey, look, there has to be something there for people to investigate, because people spend an awful lot of time moralizing for something that's apparently just a matter of opinion. And so you told me, well, they can do that. It's just a set of preferences. And so I explained, yeah, but with no other preference, do we just sit there and talk about it all the time? We've been doing it for a long time. And You might say, in the case of the physicist or in the case of the biologist or the mathematician, oh well, these people have a lot of strong ideas. These are the experts in, but a lot of experts in the field of philosophy are robust moral realists. These are people who believe in objective moral duties. These are not people who believe in a subjective morality.
Like,
And that's how we got here. Because now we're talking about whether simply lacking proof itself could be demonstrative of something being not the case. But I'm saying a lack of proof is indicative of just you not knowing rather than you coming to any real conclusion. And so you try to analogize it with Bigfoot. And I said there are problems with your Bigfoot analogy, and then I gave you the flat island analogy. And I said this is a lot easier, and you could come up with some pretty weird conclusions based upon the available evidence. But my point was simply that a lack of proof doesn't really demonstrate anything, and to try and conflate what happens with, say, morality, for instance, to Bigfoot isn't a really good way to do it, because you seemingly being uncompelled by what ethicists say is not necessarily a good dispute against these ethicists. You simply saying, show me that there's an objective morality, show me that there's good and evil, is like me saying to your views on philosophy of mind, show me exactly where atoms in this specific arrangement can arrive at consciousness rather. Like, you're asking for something that you wouldn't ask for in neuroscience.
I don't think these two fields like arrive to conclusions in the same way, though. That's the issue.
They don't, but I don't think the specific objection you bring up really matters within the context of the fields. The objection you brought up was, show me this very specific thing. And what I'm saying is, you could do this with your views on philosophy of mind. Show me what atoms produce consciousness. And if you can't do it, well, I guess consciousness doesn't arise from a material world.
Well, no, because it like if you are a materialist, you're already kind of like biting the bullet that you're using what's it called, inductive reasoning. So when I say something like, okay, I think that there's a materialistic explanation for consciousness, I am kind of like deducing that because there's been a materialistic explanation for everything else, like it seems like there's...
That's not true.
Or what hasn't there been a materialistic explanation?
Mathematics.
Well, mathematics, I mean, like, that is just... I mean, like, we could...
Yeah, so abstractions, and that's what I'm saying ethics is. It's about abstractions.
I mean, like, mathematics, like, it's an abstracted form of something that can be materialistically explained.
That's not true. Could you explain the magnitudes of infinity through something material?
I mean, if I had an infinite amount of objects, I could.
No, you couldn't, because you would still have to have levels of infinity. You would literally have to have a greater set of infinity than a normal set of infinity.
I mean, like, hypothetically, you could. Like, if we assume the universe is infinite, you could have an infinite amount of people lined up with, like, 40 feet in between each person, and then another infinite amount of people lined up with 2 feet in between each person, and you have two different magnitudes of infinity.
Wait, what?
Okay, so assuming the universe is infinite, and like we have like an infinite space bridge, let's just say.
It would have to function almost like exponentiation. Like, it couldn't even work that way.
What do you mean?
It'd be like the difference between people to the first degree and people to the second degree.
Yeah, that's the point. because there's a difference in the amount of space in between them, but there's still two
Well,
different.
multiplying infinity by 2 isn't the same thing. It's like it's even stronger than that. Also, these people would literally have to occupy the whole universe, and if they're infinite, occupying the whole universe, then doubling them would literally have to have them either extend outside the universe, because that universe itself is only its own set of infinity, and so you'd have to have another for the other people to occupy, or you'd basically have to say the universe can extend to contain 2 sets of infinity while only being 1 set of infinity, which just fucks with the idea of magnitude.
I think you can argue that in terms of what is it, axes or whatever, that you could have multiple sets of infinity. Like you could have an infinity on 1, 0, and or starting on
But even Cartesian planes are abstract in themselves. And so it's very hard. I think at least you can admit it's very difficult to make material representations of these things. But obviously, it wouldn't be the case for the materialist to say just because you can demonstrate there to be things that are non-material that it's necessarily the case that now consciousness is something that is a soul and physical based property, right? Because that's not necessarily a good inference. It's not really a good inference in general. I think we might agree on. But I'd say the same thing applies for ethics. I don't think that it's a very strong case to simply say, well, show me this, show me the specific way in which we can assign good and evil. I think the system I've built up does a good job, at least as per its own merits. But asking me to show exactly the way in which you can find good and evil is like me going, show me exactly which atoms and which arrangement produce consciousness.
Well, I would argue that through however much you value inductive reasoning, that through materialism, there's been more evidence of materialism generally being correct than there has towards a system of ethics being correct. So we could inductively reasoning which one is more likely, even if we can't inductively prove one to exist.
Well, even if we say that materialism has a very strong explanatory power, and that no system of ethics so far has produced a very strong explanatory power, we'll just say that's the case for the sake of it. It still wouldn't explain away how exactly all these people are investigating morality. What are we all investigating if it's simply just a matter of opinion?
I don't know. I guess we could be investigating nothing. I would say it's a social construct.
I know that's a weird thing though, and the reason I think it's a weird thing is specifically because morality has to come from somewhere, and if it comes from a social construct, then it would eventually just reduce down to individuals. Where are individuals getting their morality from? Now, if you're just going to tell me, I think there's a natural explanation and that it's just a set of physiological desires, then you're yet again trying to explain something about morality. And if you're just going to say that there's some weird preference we have and it's the equivalent of me saying that I like vanilla ice cream, then I have to wonder why exactly we spend so much time talking about it.
I don't know, because people have spent all of history talking about this.
Yeah, but why? Like, it has to be that there's something there to talk about, right? There has to be a matter of fact about it.
So why would we necessarily default on it just being not the case rather than it being the case?
Because saying it is the case is the one where we're making the that's the one where I don't know, Occam's razor, I guess, would apply here. Because when you're saying there is an objective morality, you're making a statement of fact that something exists which has not been proven. Where if you're saying that there isn't a subjective morality, or even just I don't know if there's a subjective morality, you're just stating, okay, this thing has not been proven. Like, it's more likely that there isn't an objective morality because it hasn't been proven.
Yeah, but that's not a strong inference. Like I said, it's basically the equivalent of me saying to you, yeah, well, I guess consciousness isn't just material, since your material explanation can't account for what atoms and what specific arrangement produce consciousness.
I mean, like, you could argue that we've been approaching the answer, even if we don't have the answer. So you could argue that we built up more evidence that we will eventually find that answer, whereas more spiritual explanations have failed to produce results that lead to the idea that there is in fact a soul.
Well, the problems with saying there's soul are more so the questions of like properties, oftentimes, not really like the demonstration of there being souls. We like could not physically interact with it, so there'd be no way for us to demonstrate it. We'd have to reason it, and then you just have to argue with the reasons. And so what the materialist would do is oftentimes problematize the idea of there being a soul. But you can do the same things with a material belief, is my thing. Like, there are plenty of criticism, but the easiest one to make is literally just show me exactly how you produce consciousness with these atoms and these arrangements. And so what the counter argument is what she basically brought up. The predictions thus far seem to support it. But if you want to say that there are no predictions that support ethics, on what basis? Because certainly there's a matter of fact as to whether morality is something that's independent of us. We have to understand that much. As far as logic extends, this must be the case. Now, if you want to say there's been no system of ethics that has had the predictive power of neuroscience, then on the basis of what? I think deontology has been very strong. You could also argue similar things for consequentialism. These two systems of belief have produced very strong results as to how people value. So, because you have to like determine what exactly makes a evaluation predictively correct as per moral standard.
We're gonna have to end this soon because my internet is starting to lag.
Okay, buddy.
Is there anything else you wanna end this on?
Yeah, I just thought it was a pretty fun conversation. Like I said, I think my system of ethics stands well. I think there are obviously certain bullets I have to bite, but I think these certain bullets are okay. But I don't think, at least in any practical sense, they'll ever run into errors where I have to be particularly worried. And I know it was definitely a good conversation, buddy. I'd be willing to talk to you again some other time if you want to.
Well, it must have been a good conversation because it's lasted almost 4 hours.
Holy fuck, dude. Oh my god, this is going to be a pain in the ass to upload.
Is there anything that you want me to like look up or think about more or something like that for a future conversation?
Yeah, anything I have, I'll just DM you.